I'll call this hearing to order this afternoon. Today's hearing is entitled EPA's Greenhouse Gas Regulations and Their Effect on American Jobs. Certainly one of the major issues facing the American people today is getting the economy stimulated, creating jobs, and one of the reasons all of us, or at least many of us, are very much concerned about the activities of EPA at this particular time is that they have a queue of about 30 regulations. Great emphasis on
Chairman, you probably need to go to another microphone. He's kind of picking it up on the tape. Ours is open. Mine's open.
This one works here, Ed.
yeah. Could you hear me?
No, you couldn't.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm sorry for the inconvenience here. For those who heard me, I'm sorry you're going to have to listen to me again for a few minutes. Today's hearing is entitled EPA's Greenhouse Gas Regulations and Their Effect on American Jobs. The American people are primarily interested in stimulating their economy today and creating jobs. One of the concerns that many of us on this side of the aisle have, as well as others on the other side of the aisle, is that the long list of regulations being considered at EPA today, we have a very real concern that they're going to have a significant impact on our ability to create jobs. I might also say that the energy debate in America today has been summed up in about 6 words, and this is where we are. Fossil fuels are bad, green energy is good. And I think most of us recognize that it's a lot more complicated than that, and I recognize that in order to meet our increased demands just on the electricity side, we're going to have electricity produced from all sources. But the Obama administration has placed so much emphasis on green energy. Billions of dollars from the stimulus fund has gone for that. All sorts of tax incentives have gone for that. And the problem that I have with it is not that we're spending taxpayers' dollars to help develop green energy, but I think the American people are being misled on the role that green energy can play in the immediate future. For example, the Obama administration recently came out with a ruling that they wanted to reduce the 2005 greenhouse gas emissions by 83% by the year 2035. Now, when you think about that formula, that's kind of complicated. What does that really mean? Why not just say we're going to allow so many tons of emission by this date? Well, I think that it's being done because they don't want the American people to recognize really what they're saying. If you look at the numbers of reducing the 2005 emissions by 83%, what you're talking about, you're taking America back to 1920, in the 1920s. That's the last time we had emissions that low. And I will tell you what, in the 1920s, only 2% of rural homes in America had electricity. Around 50% of American homes in the rest of the country had electricity. We didn't have any cell phones. We didn't have any flat-screen TVs. We didn't have any Blackberries. We didn't have iPods or iPads. So to think that we're going to reduce by 2035 87% of 2005 emissions, in my view, is a pipe dream. Now, having said that, I know this administration is making the argument that green energy is going to carry our country, and that's where the jobs are going to be created. But in my view, and from the analysis that I've looked at, and from all the hearings I've sat through the years, I don't think anyone realistically believes that green energy can provide the electricity needs of America anytime soon. 52% of our electricity still comes from coal. 70% of electricity produced in China comes from coal. American railroads are taking more coal to the ports today for export to China than at any time in its history. In 2006, 6.7 billion tons of coal were used worldwide. 2010, it was over 10 billion tons. And they anticipate the additional coal necessary just to meet the needs of China and India in the next few years is going to increase another billion or so. So, yes, we need green energy. We need natural gas. We need nuclear energy. But we also are going to have coal to meet the expected increase in demand. So the point that I would simply try to make is let's be realistic here. Let's not mislead the American people. Let's have an honest give and take discussion, answer questions, ask questions, and try to come out with the right policy for the American people. And that's what these hearings are designed to do. And we look forward to the testimony today. I will introduce all of you a little bit later, right before you testify. But at this time, I would recognize the gentleman from Illinois for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the guests for attending today's hearing. Mr. Chairman, there seems to be a concerted effort by many of my colleagues on your side of the aisle to delegitimize the science that says greenhouse gases are pollutants and therefore should be regulated. Additionally, in an attempt to counteract all the various respected peer-reviewed studies that show the environmental protection industry actually creates jobs and stimulates the economy, as well as leads to a healthier and more productive constituency. Today we will hear testimony that will lead us to believe that any policy that regulates greenhouse gases will automatically lead to job loss. However, it is extremely important for us to remember that just because it is possible to find some within the scientific community to dispute what the other 90% of scientists agree on, that climate change is man-made, does not make the lone dissenters the authority on this very important issue. And just because different industry sources pay to produce studies that show that regulating greenhouse gases will be costly and will yield little to no benefit, doesn't make it true. My point here is that all studies are not equal, and we should carefully vet those individuals who disagree with the vast majority of respected scientists worldwide on the causes of climate change, as well as those who dispute the reports that say moving toward more efficient and cleaner energy technologies will lead to substantially greater costs without the added benefits. In fact, once again, Mr. Chairman, our side tried to invite one scientist to sit on the witness panel today, only to be again rebuffed by the other side. I cannot imagine why this committee will attempt to move such sweeping and regressive legislation, such as Upton Inhofe, that will repeal EPA's ability to regulate harmful greenhouse gases without hearing the scientific evidence of how this will impact our economy, our environment, and the public health. I sincerely hope that we will be able to hear from scientists at a future hearing so that we will be able to make informed decisions before moving to any markup of this legislation in this area. After all, just because we may try to ignore the science behind greenhouse gas emissions and how it affects climate changes does not mean it does not exist. We know that since the inception of the Clean Air Act, opponents of the greenhouse bill have been warning that environmental regulations will kill jobs and lead to outsourcing overseas. Clean Air Act opponents falsely predicted that electricity prices would skyrocket if the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments were passed, when in fact electricity prices actually declined in the decade following 1990 by approximately 18%. While we hear that regulating greenhouse gases will cripple our economy and destroy our manufacturing industry, the U.S. Census Bureau conducted an annual survey of the U.S. manufacturing sector and found that pollution abatement operating costs were only 0.4% on average of overall manufacturing costs, including not just air pollution controls, but all other abatement costs. Mr. Chairman, actually the Clean Air Act has been one of the most successful and bipartisan environmental laws enacted in American history. Mr. Chairman, I will submit that history has proven that we can protect our environment and also strengthen our economy through sensible and balanced regulations that help create jobs and new technologies, protect the public's interest, increase worker productivity, and promote clean air. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. And at this time, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is about jobs in the economy, and to imply anything otherwise is misleading. We had this debate in the last Congress, and studies estimated that a cap-and-trade national energy tax would produce job losses in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Yet EPA is unilaterally acting to impose the very same type of policies that Congress rejected in the 111th Congress. Job losses that would come from a cap and tax were not intended consequences. The whole point of federally regulating greenhouse gas emissions is to drive up energy costs so that consumers and businesses are forced to use less. As the President said, under my plan, electricity prices will necessarily skyrocket. Congress said no, but now we face an EPA trying to sneak regulations in through the back door. The job losses will span many sectors and businesses large and small. We do live in
hydrating coconut water. New Revlon Color Stay Aqua Mineral Makeup is a refreshing, lightweight powder which feels cool on your skin.
Not my fault, Mr. Rush.
Leaving it smooth and luminous all day. I've never felt makeup like this before. New Revlon Color Stay Aqua Mineral Makeup.
Yes. That's called
I like
Clearly, Mr. Chairman,
Rush, I liked your ringtone better than that one.
this is clearly not the Communications and Technology
That's
Subcommittee.
Right. That's right. Really fix your hair right with that Revlon commercial. All right. We live in a global economy with global competition, and nations like China have absolutely no intention of similarly burdening their industries. Manufacturing jobs will leave this country unless EPA is stopped. Even for those who don't lose their jobs, the news would not be good. EPA's agenda will boost the price at the pump and drive up electricity bills. It will make farming costs more and hike prices of food. So let's dispel a myth. Air quality and public health will not be harmed or affected in any way by efforts to slow and then stop EPA's expansive global warming agenda under the Clean Air Act. Since 1970, the Clean Air Act has targeted air pollutants like particulates, ozone, lead, mercury, pollutants known to have adverse health impacts. The result has been a declining emissions of these pollutants, and we need to make sure that they continue to decline. Absolutely none of these efforts are impeded in any way under the Energy Tax Prevention Act discussion draft. EPA's ability and obligation to regulate and mitigate air pollutants like particulates that cause soot, ozone that cause smog, carbon monoxide, lead, asbestos, chloroform, and almost 200 other air pollutants would be protected and preserved. So we can stop the EPA from imposing cap and tax, and the Clean Air Act will continue to make our families and communities healthier places. So let's listen to the facts. This issue is not about air quality and public health. It's about jobs. EPA is not looking at the impact on jobs. The members of this committee should, and we must, and I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Barton.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Upton. And we can tell that when you speak, your opponents try to spam you, so your message doesn't get out. It is a good deal to have a hearing, and I appreciate Chairman Whitfield having this hearing on the EPA's greenhouse gas regulation and their effect on American jobs. The answer is self-obvious. If you have something that is really not a pollutant, which CO2 is not, as I'm giving this speech, I'm creating CO2, and you don't have the technology to regulate it, and unless there's been a miracle occur in the last 2 or 3 days, if you burn stuff with carbon in it, you're going to create CO2. It's a chemical fact. So we don't have a technology that can control it. So if you regulate greenhouse gases or regulate CO2, in effect, you're going to, by definition, cost jobs, because you're going to shut down probably 40% of our energy production economy in the United States, maybe 50%. So in spite of the hypothesis that CO2 is a pollutant, and in spite of the massive educational program to try to convince the American people and the world that CO2 is bad, the facts are otherwise, and I'm going to be absolutely stunned if in this hearing we don't hear from our industrial friends that if you really regulate CO2 to the extent that Chairman Whitfield was talking about in the Waxman-Markey bill, you're basically shutting down the U.S. economy, and that's tens of millions of jobs and hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is a very good hearing, and I hope, Mr. Chairman, as a result of this hearing, we do begin to move the Whitfield Upton bill to make it explicitly clear that the Clean Air Act does not apply to greenhouse gases. And with that, I yield back to Chairman Upton. I yield back to the subcommittee chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. At this time, I recognize the ranking member from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this hearing reminds me of an article that appeared in the New York Times magazine on Sunday. The article was titled Fact-Free Science, and it describes how Washington has been infected by a mainstreaming and radicalization of anti-scientific thought. Today's hearing could be an example A of anti-scientific thought in this House. We're falling down a rabbit hole into Wonderland where the facts are turned upside down and fiction is accepted as reality. The premise of this hearing and the legislation that it's being reviewed is that climate change is a hoax, and EPA's modest efforts to reduce carbon pollution will imperil our economy. These claims remind me of William James, who once said, "There is nothing so absurd that it cannot be believed as truth if repeated often enough." These are the facts. Climate change is real, and our future economic prosperity depends on investing in a new clean energy economy. If we don't act to reduce carbon pollution and promote clean energy, we will lose millions of clean energy jobs to the countries that do. China understands this. The Chinese are investing over $2 billion each week in renewable and other green technologies. And so does Europe, which is racing ahead of us in reducing carbon emissions and developing advances in solar energy and green buildings. Last Congress, CEOs from our nation's leading companies like General Electric and Duke Power told us that billions of dollars in private capital has been frozen because the United States does not have a long-term plan for reducing carbon emissions. The CEO of PG&E, one of the nation's largest utilities, warned of an incredible lost opportunity if we don't act now. He said, there are these amazing developing new technology centers across the United States, and we see those jobs going overseas and technology superiority going overseas. The cost of inaction is not just the loss of leadership in the global economy. We also risk irreversible and potentially catastrophic impacts. Our weather is getting more extreme and more dangerous every year. Last year was the hottest and wettest on record. Floods in Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee killed dozens. They submerged much of Pakistan and Australia, and droughts in Russia and China are driving food prices to record levels. The risks to our economy from climate change are real and are potentially enormous, and that is why we cannot have an informed debate about the economic costs of EPA regulation if we ignore these impacts. If we look only at the costs of regulation without considering the costs of doing nothing, we're looking at only half of the equation. Ranking Member Rush and I have been urging that the subcommittee consider the scientific evidence. We asked for a leading scientific expert to be invited to testify today, but this request was denied. We asked for a hearing on 2 new studies linking severe weather events to man-made climate change, but we have not yet received a response. For this reason, we are invoking our rights under the House rules to request a minority hearing with scientists. Last month, we heard testimony from Senator Inhofe that climate change is a hoax. We need to hear from real scientists before we mark up the Upton-Inhofe bill. Mr. Chairman, I ask that our letter requesting this hearing be made a part of today's hearing record.
Without objection.
I have one other concern about today's hearing, and that is the decision to put the EPA Assistant Administrator, Gina McCarthy, on the second panel. This is inconsistent with the practices of our committee. I raised my concern with Chairman Upton earlier today. He agreed that the general rule should be that the administration witnesses testify first on their own panel. That has been the tradition, Democratic and Republican administrations. Yeah. But the committee would proceed differently. That wouldn't happen today. It's too late to change the order of today's hearing, but that the committee would proceed differently in the future hearings. I thank him, and Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this courtesy to make this statement, and look forward to working with you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Waxman. And before I introduce the members of this panel who will be testifying today, I did want to say that, of course, Congress, we were not here last week, and when I came back yesterday, my staff did give me a copy of the February 24th letter that you and Mr. Rush wrote, in which you did request to convene a hearing to discuss the new studies that you had indicated. I might say that over the last 2 Congresses, we have had in the Congress over 24 hearings on climate change and the science relating to it, which I do have a list of here. However, I understand also that under the Rule 11 procedure, you all are entitled to a hearing with witnesses on the climate change issue that you want to bring up. It's also my understanding, after talking to the parliamentarian, that as the chairman of the subcommittee, I would have the opportunity to set the date for that hearing. And I would just, in order to approach this in a correct way and try to have regular order, I would be happy to notice a hearing. We could notice it today. For your two witnesses that you would like, maybe we'd bring in a witness or two to maybe give a different view than your witnesses might give. But and we could do it even next Tuesday. Now, I said next Tuesday simply because we've looked at the calendar out for 3-4 weeks, and it is very, very full. We're doing lots of hearings on all the subcommittees. But if you, Mr. Waxman, and Mr. Rush would be willing to have this hearing next Tuesday, you select your witnesses. We would notice it today. I don't want to get involved myself in taking a lot of time and determining who all these witnesses are just because of the time constraints. But if you all would be willing to give us the name of those two witnesses, we could notice it today. We could have the hearing next Tuesday. And
Would the chairman yield?
yes.
I appreciate the chairman yielding. But before we commit to a specific date, I would encourage the subcommittee chairman to enter into a discussion with Mr. Waxman and Mr. Rush and Mr. Upton. Normally, first of all, it's very rare to invoke a Rule 11 hearing, but when it does happen, there normally is some discussion about timing so that both the minority and the majority have adequate time to prepare and also get adequate witnesses. And at least in this member's perspective, it would be very difficult to have an appropriate, proper hearing by next Tuesday, given everything that's happening this week and is scheduled to already happen next week. But I do think if you have a discussion with our distinguished minority ranking members at the subcommittee and full committee, you could very expeditiously schedule such a hearing that helps both sides.
Well, Mr. Barton, I really appreciate your comments. I will say that we had a 1-hour meeting with staff looking out at the calendar on this issue. And, of course, I'm not speaking for Mr. Rush and Mr. Waxman. They may find next Tuesday inconvenient. But my understanding from reading the letter and from discussions that I've had with our staff, we were talking about maybe 2 witnesses on your all side. And I think we've identified 1 or 2. I think it could be done rather quickly. However, obviously, I'm simply making the offer. And yes, sir.
It's okay. Yeah. Look, I just think it's important to hear from scientists on this issue before we mark up this bill. And I'm happy to discuss the schedule with you. I can't make any promises at this point, but I want to work with you in good faith that we can have this hearing. It's an important part of the debate. And if we're going to pass legislation out of this subcommittee, the subcommittee should have a hearing before we do that. That's my only...
Well, I would be happy to do it with you. I am offering you that we would do a hearing on Tuesday. I can't commit that we'll have
do our best for Tuesday, but let's...
But let me just say, I can't commit that we'll have a hearing before we have a markup.
Mr. Chairman,
I don't know that date's been set.
Mr. Chairman, I think that that's absolutely critical that the outside be allowed to have this hearing based on scientists of our choosing. I'm sure you have scientists also, but to have a hearing after the markup for the subcommittee would be almost without any meaning. I think the members of the subcommittee need to hear from scientists. They need to hear from scientists of our choosing about this important matter. So,
well, like I said, I mean, we've had 24 hearings on the science.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I would just ask: are you planning on having a markup on this hearing next week?
I can say for myself that we have not decided specifically on a day for a markup that I'm aware of. However, we do want to move quickly. I think we made that very clear in the beginning. We want to move quickly on this. And I might say that I think our regular order has been much better, not to get into the health care bill of last year, but we didn't have an opportunity to even offer an amendment on the House floor on that bill. But I'm offering you all an opportunity to do a hearing on Tuesday. And if not, I suppose, obviously, you have the right to invoke a Rule 11 and go from there.
Mr. Chairman, let's notice your hearing for next Tuesday. We'll do our best to get the witnesses there.
Okay. So we'll notice a hearing for next Tuesday.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield for 1 second?
Yes.
Just to fulfill this debate. If I remember correctly, when we moved the Waxman-Markey bill, we continuously asked for an economic analysis. We never had a hearing on that prior to the markup of the bill. We did get a hearing 2 weeks after we marked up the bill. So, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And what we're trying to do here, as we tried to do a couple weeks ago, is talk about the economic impacts. So let's understand the history behind this. And we didn't get a chance to deal with the economic aspects. Not a single hearing. The bill was marked up. Then 2 weeks later, we had a hearing on the economic impact.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I will.
We did have, before there was a markup, an EPA analysis. I think that the members wanted further analysis of it, but we did have that before the markup. But
You are reclaiming my time. We don't consider the EPA the expert on economic impact, especially when in our hearing of 2 weeks ago, they readily admitted that they don't consider economic impacts in their decisions. I would be happy to.
We could go back and forth. You did this, we did that. We've asked for a hearing. The chairman has suggested that we take next Tuesday. We're trying to accommodate that request. And I think it's helpful for all of us to get all the information we need. And I would think it's, since it is an important scientific controversy with members.
Just reclaiming my time, and I agree with you. I'm just setting the record straight, and I yield back.
Would the ranking member yield for a question if it's his time?
I don't have time. It was the gentleman from Illinois.
Would the chairman yield?
I'll recognize the gentleman.
I'd like to ask my distinguished friend from California, are there some new studies that have come out in the last week, month, even 6 months that you believe are different than all the other studies that we've seen in the last, say, 12 months? Is there some
Well, I see 6 members attending this hearing today who are not on the committee in previous Congresses. I think it would be well for them to be informed.
So
I
the
think it's
answer is
well
no.
worth getting testimony. I think it's an essential part of doing legislation.
Mm-hmm. But the answer is no. There's no new information.
There are new studies linking carbon emissions to severe weather, and I think that's an important part of what we've been looking at around the world.
I think.
Just for a moment.
I think that
Okay.
Chairman Whitfield is a saint.
Wait, before, Ms. Waxman, if you're not getting ready to leave, are you? No. Okay, good.
If I have the time, I'm going to yield to my friend from Chicago briefly before Chairman Whitfield reclaims the gavel and moves the hearing forward.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I think that it's absolutely essential for us to have this hearing with these scientists because the matter before us is very important. And I think that it really will inform members. There may be some amendments to this bill that we will be discussing that will be ignited and that will be initiated because of testimony. And I do possibly see that there might be some amendments that might even be bipartisan once we hear the scientists. So I think that this is really absolutely necessary for us to move forward with this hearing so that we can discuss this in the fullest, to its fullest effect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Whoever has the time, would you yield further to me?
I do, and I'm going to yield one last time to Chairman Waxman. And before
I asked earlier today in my opening statement that we make part of the record information on some new studies. We pointed out in our letter to the chairman that there are 2 new studies linking severe weather events to man-made climate change. And I think it's important for us to hear about it, even if you don't believe it's true.
I am happy to look at these new information. Being a registered professional engineer, I am always interested in the truth and will be more than happy to.
During the 111th Congress, there was only one scientist who testified that science didn't justify action, and that was Patrick Michaels. And as the chairman knows, we are currently examining whether he was fully forthcoming with the committee. I don't think the only scientist supposed witness on science should be Senator Inhofe. It's something as important as that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. let me
We're
just say,
willing to take yes for an answer, Mr.
good. Now, we have votes on the floor. We just have 2 votes, and then we're going to come back immediately because we want to hear your testimony. But before we break, I just want to make sure that I understand here what we've committed to. This is a regular hearing, not a invoking Rule 11 hearing. Notice today, hearing scheduled for Tuesday. You select your 2 witnesses regarding the studies, and we'll get a witness or 2.
We want it to be a regular hearing. We may need more than 2 witnesses. We'll discuss that with you. I don't know what difference.
We would like to have the names of them today, though.
We'll do our best.
Okay.
We did send you a letter before the recess.
You did. You absolutely did.
And we're working with you in good faith. We just think this is an important part of the process.
Okay, well, we're going to take about a 10 or 15-minute recess, and then we'll be back, and I'll introduce this panel, and hopefully the next part of this hearing will even be more exciting than the first part. Okay, thank you all so much for your patience, and at this time, I would like to introduce the panel of the witnesses to the first panel. First of all, we have Mr. Mike Carey, who's president of the Ohio Coal Association. We have Mr. Paul Ciccio, president of Industrial Energy Consumers of America. Mr. Hugh Joyce, president of the James River Air Conditioning Company. Mr. Forrest McConnell, president of McConnell Honda and Acura. Mr. David Montgomery, Vice President of Charles River Associates, and Professor Dan Riker, who is Professor of Law and Director of the Styler-Taylor Center for Energy Policy at Stanford Law School. So, extend a warm welcome to you all. We need your assistance. We look forward to your testimony. And I would remind each of you that you have 5 minutes for your opening statements. At the end of that time, once we've completed the entire panel, we'll have questions from the members. So at this point, Mr. Carey, I'll recognize you for a 5-minute opening statement, and we'll go right down the line. Be sure and turn your microphone up.
There it is. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the committee, good afternoon. I want to thank you for today for inviting me for the opportunity to testify. My name is Mike Carey. I'm president of the Ohio Coal Association. We are a trade organization that employs roughly 3,000 Americans in our Ohio coal mines. And according to many independent studies, that number goes up to roughly 30,000 secondary jobs in the coal fields. It is difficult for me to confine my remarks today on only the greenhouse gas regulations, because our industry nationwide is facing an unprecedented onslaught of new rules that will eliminate coal and the direct and indirect jobs associated with it. To be clear, we are not advocating for a rollback or repeal of the current existing Clean Air Act programs. But what is coming out of the Obama EPA is a host of new regulatory proposals, including the Clean Air Transport Rule and the Utility MAC. Already, because of threats from the administration and the EPA, United States power-producing companies have announced that they have plans to retire close to 14,000 megawatts of coal-fired electric generation by 2011 through 2020. To be clear, CO2 does not have a negative health impact. In fact, a repeal is not a rollback of the Clean Air Act. Congress did not intend for it to be regulated in 1990 and has not passed cap-and-trade legislation. It is also important to remember what EPA Director Lisa Jackson said just 2 years ago when she was asked what unilateral U.S. action on climate change would do. She said, and I quote, "It would have no significant impact on atmospheric greenhouse gas levels," end of quote. But the manufacturing jobs in my home state of Ohio and those of the surrounding states of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Kentucky, and Michigan would ultimately see jobs go to China and India for no environmental benefit. In 2008, President Obama said, and I quote again, "If someone wants to build a new coal-fired power plant, they can, but it will bankrupt them because they will be charged a huge sum for all the greenhouse gas that they are being emitting." The President could have been clearer with his intentions, and his administration is following forward on their war on the American coal industry. This legislation that we are discussing today recognizes the logical starting point. and that is that Congress never intended greenhouse gases to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. It is my hope that this committee will take action on all legislation that will interpret this flood of regulations that are an overt attack on our industry. Not only just our industry, but the low-cost power-producing facilities that consume our product and ultimately the American manufacturing base. We are already seeing some of the effects of the Obama EPA's plan to regulate greenhouse gases. Domestic energy resource companies that had plans to grow job-creating economic development projects simply have mothballed them. And in many ways, companies cannot get access to the critical capital from the lenders because of the uncertainty. As this committee contemplates the regulating the specifics of greenhouse gas over a certain period of time, like a 2-year time period, should not be a viable solution. I think those of us who have worked with bureaucracies to try to obtain permits over the years, or even a direct answer, know that a 2-year delay of greenhouse gas regulations is nothing more than a political ploy, and no one in this industry is fooled by that tactic. Why are these EPA regulations such a problem? First, through the courts, EPA has been given an unchecked, arbitrary authority over jobs through the Clean Air Act permitting. These actions are unaccountable to anybody, including Congress. The mere existence of the flawed illegal tailoring rule concept shows that the EPA is redefining on their own, outside of congressional authority, who they believe should get special consideration, much like the political waivers under the health care law. Under present circumstances, the EPA can purposely err in granting a permit, thereby allowing activists to object and sue in court. Already, we are seeing groups such as the Center for Biological Diversity challenging dozens of projects across this country on the grounds of climate under NEPA. What is ultimately needed is an independent review. I believe that we need legislation that mandates that the House and the Senate review and approve all significant rules or regulations that are promulgated by the executive branch. We have this in the state of Ohio, and we have had it for many years. The question really comes down to whether Congress wants the EPA to unilaterally decide where economic development will occur, in which industry, and how much Americans will pay for their energy. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I stand ready to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Mr. Ciccio, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Rush, the privilege to be here. IECA, the Industrial Energy Consumers of America, is an organization of manufacturing companies. We have no oil companies, no coal companies, no natural gas companies, and no electric utilities. We are manufacturers that produce widgets. While the manufacturing sector is rebounding, we continue, unfortunately, to lose competitiveness. The Commerce Department reported on February 11th that the 2010 trade deficit rose to $498 billion, a 32.8% increase, the largest in a decade. China represented nearly 55% of the deficit. Our country and we in manufacturing are locked in global competition with other countries and their manufacturing sectors, and we are losing. We must, once again, become a country that embraces manufacturing with policies that foster capital investment, innovation, low relative energy costs, and regulations that are cost-effective and provide certainty. The EPA greenhouse gas regulation is an example of regulation that creates uncertainty and discourages investment. And when added to the many other new regulations, it is understandable why corporate America is sitting on $2 trillion of cash. The irony is that the manufacturing sector places a high priority on energy efficiency. We are the most we spend more time and money on energy efficiency than any other sector of the economy, yet we disapprove of the EPA greenhouse gas regulations that set a maximum achievable control technology on energy efficiency, especially when there are positive and cost-effective ways of achieving significant energy efficiency through greater use of industrial combined heat and power, or waste heat recovery, or energy efficiency in buildings, and buildings consume 40% of all the energy in the country. A better way that we have proposed is what we call the Sustainable Manufacturing Growth Initiative. It's policies that will revitalize the manufacturing sector over 10 years by improving industrial energy efficiency, and it also improves efficiency in buildings. And that modeling of what we are proposing would reduce 10% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 10 years, create 3.2 million man-year jobs, and unlock capital fixed investment of $407 billion that would be invested in the United States rather than in some other country. This is an initiative that every manufacturer in the country would support. In contrast, I do not know at this time a single manufacturer that produces products in the United States that supports the EPA greenhouse gas regulation. And the reason why is that under EPA regulations, EPA takes decision-making out of the hands of manufacturing. They mandate when capital must be spent on energy efficiency technology projects. It mandates what energy efficiency projects will be completed, even if it is inconsistent with the scope or timing of other manufacturing production plans or business strategies or priorities. It mandates what technology will be used, even if that technology is not cost-effective or desirable for the type or quality of the products that that facility produces. It mandates what manufacturing practices will be used to operate the facility, taking decision-making out of the hands of manufacturing plant operations people and putting it in the hands of the EPA. Mr. Chairman, the U.S. manufacturing sector has lost 5.4 million manufacturing jobs in 10 years, 31%. And unless we work together, this Congress and with this administration, we're not going to get those jobs back. And we look forward to working with you to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Joyce, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'm the owner of James River Air Conditioning, located in Richmond, Virginia. We perform HVAC, plumbing, electrical, solar, and geothermal work on residential and commercial construction and retrofit projects. We currently have 150 full-time employees. My father started the company in 1967, and I joined in 1977 while I was still in high school and worked my way up to president and owner. I have always made it a priority to conduct business with environmental consequences of my decisions and actions kept in mind. I'm a member of the U.S. Green Building Council and manage LEED certified green housing projects. In fact, we designed, supervised, and constructed the first LEED Platinum house certified in Richmond. It was completed in September 2010. 95% of its energy comes from solar power. It is also connected to Google Power Meter, which gives it a daily efficiency rating. We also focus on energy efficiency in our own office building, which generates 10% of its power with solar panels on the roof. I am making these examples for two reasons. One, I have bet the entire net worth and the future of my business on conservation, green construction, and reducing greenhouse gases, and implementing practical green strategies for myself and my clients. Secondly, efficiency and conservation make good business sense, and I want to leave the world in a better place as a result of my work. Let me emphasize that I and many other small business owners choose to run our companies this way, without government mandates. Attempts by the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act will drive up our costs and will hinder economic recovery, particularly in the construction industry. Construction impacts our economy significantly. Currently, new construction is down 50 to 90% in my market. Some houses and commercial buildings in Richmond are selling for less than the raw cost of materials to rebuild them. It routinely takes 6 months to plan and permit a project. A federal permit would cause the process to take even longer. The cost of modeling and engineering and reviewing and pre-permitting and cutting through the EPA red tape to permit, as the new finding rules indicate would be the case, could add 1 to 4% in professional cost to the average construction job. Currently, expenditures on material, labor, and insurance are increasing, yet buildings are selling for less. Any new permitting mandates that increase cost, like the EPA's regulatory plan, would further limit new construction jobs. Simply put, more confusion, greater uncertainty means less work and fewer construction jobs. Due to the already heavily regulated nature of the construction industry, I have one full-time employee dedicated to monitoring and ensuring compliance with regulations. Additional employees contribute to regulatory compliance as well. Regulations such as the EPA greenhouse gas rules would be extremely burdensome for business and clients. According to the SBA, small businesses spend 36% more per employee on regulations than their larger counterparts, and 360% more on environmental regulation. Environmental regulations alone cost my business approximately $150,000 a year. Combining that with other regulations, the total regulatory cost for my business is nearly $250,000 a year. As a small business owner, my hope is that instead of punitive government policies, we can incentivize environmentally friendly behavior. The EPA's own Energy Star program is one such example. When it comes to reducing greenhouse gases and pollution and moving this country forward, I believe we can get more with sugar than we can with vinegar. Let's tap the power of American innovation, new clean energy sources, incentives, and free market forces to win the battle against pollution. Please help us avoid regulations that will increase costs and create barriers to new jobs, and will have little or no effect on reducing overall global pollution. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. Mr. McConnell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, my name is Forrest McConnell. I'm president of McConnell Honda and Acura of Montgomery, Alabama. I'm testifying on behalf of the National Automobile Dealers Association. Today, there are 3 different fuel economy programs administered by 3 different agencies under 3 different standards pursuant to 3 different laws. America's auto dealers support a single national fuel economy program under CAFE, beginning in model year 2017, is the best way to increase fuel economy, protect jobs, preserve passenger safety, and reduce vehicle tailpipe CO2 emissions. Congress did not intend fuel economy to be regulated by NHTSA, EPA, and California together when it passed the bipartisan 10 and 10 Fuel Economy Act in 2007. It is paramount for Congress to reassert its primacy over this area and return the still recovering auto industry into a single national fuel economy standard. There are numerous advantages to this approach. First, its terms are set by you, Congress. Second, only CAFE mandates the balancing of all the important considerations when setting fuel economy standards: jobs, safety, customer choice, and customer acceptability. Third, CAFE was written specifically to regulate fuel economy. The Clean Air Act, for all its virtues, was not. California's regulation was written also to regulate fuel economy, but only in California. Its application in other states results in what the EPA Administrator Jackson calls a patchwork of state standards. Fourth, a single national fuel economy is, by definition, uniform and consistent, unlike what we have today. While the next round of fuel economy rulemaking will not take effect until model year 2017, the rules are being drafted now in Sacramento and Washington. As a dealer, I'm worried about the challenges California's regulation would impose on my industry and our customers. According to a recent New York Times, a California official has indicated that CARB, California Air Resource Board, will implement its patchwork regime in the California states in the next round of rulemaking if necessary. This would be problematic for auto dealers and customers because, unlike CAFE, CARB's regulations will distort the auto market and do nothing additional to decrease greenhouse gas emissions or improve fuel economy on a national basis. California's approach to fuel economy regulation involves loopholes, exemptions, market distortions, and does not balance national factors. CAFE has none of these defects. Congress needs to reaffirm that this body sets national fuel economy policy, not California regulators. Mr. Chairman, it is doubtful that Congress would ever enact 3 competing fuel economy programs. State regulation is unnecessary. Regulation of tailpipe CO2 emissions by EPA is redundant, as the only way to reduce such emissions is to increase a vehicle's fuel economy, which CAFE regulates. America's auto dealers support a single national program, fuel economy program, and increases in fuel economy that makes sense to customers. It is important that the structure of the fuel economy program is sound so that the stringency of the fuel economy standard will be correct. That structure must leverage, not frustrate, consumer demand. Unless customers actually buy new vehicles, the environmental and economic benefits will not be realized. I urge Congress to return to a single national fuel economy standard under CAFE to avoid that risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. Mr. Montgomery, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. My name is David Montgomery. I'm an economist, and I have been working on the topic of this hearing for more years than I like to remember. I will be discussing my own opinions today as an economist. I have formed them over many years. I have numerous publications in peer-reviewed professional journals dealing with quantitative studies of the costs of greenhouse gas regulations and related topics. I'll be happy to discuss my qualifications in questions if anyone has any questions about my my ability or my objectivity on this subject. I will say that although I'm discussing my own opinions, not necessarily those of my employer or my clients, I believe, in fact, I am certain that the vast majority of economists working in this area will agree specifically with the points that I'm making today, which is basically that there will be costs to greenhouse gas regulations. Nevertheless, there are studies that have been circulated around Washington that claim greenhouse gas regulations will increase total employment and stimulate long-term green growth. These are the claims that come from a politically motivated fringe of the profession. They reach these happy conclusions by simply leaving out half the story. They describe and count only the jobs associated with regulatory compliance and ignore all the jobs lost in the rest of the economy due to higher costs of doing business. They fail to recognize that resources are limited, so that money spent complying with regulations is money diverted away from other productive purposes. These studies are typified by a series of reports by the Political Economy Research Institute that were sponsored by politically powerful organizations known as Ceres and the Center for American Progress. They use a simple procedure called multiplier analysis that, like the philosopher's stone, turns the cost of compliance with regulations into the goal of added jobs. But it's fool's gold. If these studies used any comprehensive model of the U.S. economy, they would be forced to account for where the resources expended on regulatory compliance come from. When I did that, I found that in 2015, adding even the most cost-effective forms of greenhouse gas regulation to other pending EPA regulations would increase wholesale electricity prices by 35 to 40%, would reduce average worker compensation by about $700 per year, and would shrink all sectors of the economy. The biggest hits would be on electricity, coal, and energy-intensive industries. I don't even need to repeat that the energy-intensive industries face competition from industries in other countries and regions that are not bearing these kinds of added costs, and that they're quite vulnerable there. The net of other parts of the economy, other industries, would take up some of the slack, for sure. But on the net effect on the whole economy of these regulations would be that it would be growing less robustly. Now let's turn to impacts on workers. Using this comprehensive approach, total worker compensation, I estimate, would be driven down in 2015 by about 1.5%. If that reduction in compensation were to take the form of lost jobs, it would imply the loss of close to 2 million jobs, not the gains claimed by green jobs advocates. Or, if our labor markets work efficiently and wages adjust to lower productivity, it would be a loss of about $700 per year in compensation to each worker. Moreover, this is overly optimistic. Regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act will be much more costly than this. The reason is that in doing these calculations, I assumed an ideal system, putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions everywhere. But EPA's proposal under the Clean Air Act would use command and control regulations designed by bureaucrats who know next to nothing about the circumstances of individual businesses. Therefore, their orders cannot possibly lead to solutions as cost-effective as those that managers would find for their own emissions if they faced a price on carbon. Indeed, it's hard for me to think of a worse design for greenhouse gas policy than Clean Air Act authorities that were designed to deal with localized emissions of trace contaminants. Not only are these an excessively costly way to bring about wholesale changes in our energy system, they'll fall far short of what would have to be done to stabilize global temperatures. Pretending that EPA regulations are cost-free is only intended to distract you from designing a policy response that avoids unnecessary costs. There are many other technical deficiencies in studies of green jobs that I've described in my written testimony, but I'll end with just really 2 simple points. Given the looseness of green accounting, calculations of green jobs might simply be adding up jobs that would exist with EPA regulations or without them. So the claim of green jobs is simply relabeling. That clearly cannot create real economic benefits, though it doesn't do any harm. That's the best case. If a new job slot is created for the sole purpose of being green, then these people represent a higher cost for their employer while adding nothing to their output or revenues. If green jobs are mandated to produce goods needed only because of regulation, like replacements for prematurely retired power plants, they actually subtract from the present and future economic well-being of the nation. Regulation might be justified if it produces environmental gain that's worth these costs, but that should not obscure the fact that prematurely retiring power plants is a cost, not a benefit. Yet the logic used by green job proponents implies that the greater the unproductive investment caused by a regulation, the greater its beneficial impact on jobs. If that logic was really valid, rather than seeking out cost-effective regulation, we should seek out the highest cost way to achieve environmental goals. Businesses should hire as many workers as they can fit on the job site for every project. The result's absurd because the logic on which it's based is nonsense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Mr. Riker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Dan Riker. I'm Executive Director of the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance, a joint center of the Stanford Law School and the Graduate School of Business. Prior to Stanford, I was Director of Climate Change and Energy Initiatives at Google, President of a private equity firm that invests in energy projects, and Executive Vice President of a venture capital-backed renewable energy company. And prior to these roles, I was DOE Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy and the Department's Chief of Staff. I would like to make 2 points today. First, controlling U.S. carbon emissions, along with other policy and investment measures to address climate change and advance clean energy technology, is critical to our nation's economy, security, health, and environmental quality. Second, experience over the last few decades makes clear that well-designed environmental and energy regulation, far from being an economic drag, can spur U.S. innovation, enhance competitiveness, and often cut development and operating costs. Regarding the first point, we can debate the relative merits of the various approaches to regulating carbon emissions, but the science tells us we need to act, and the vast global market for clean energy technology tells us it is in our best economic and security interest to do so. We are unlikely to see the enactment of comprehensive climate and energy legislation anytime soon. Therefore, EPA's current authority to regulate carbon emissions should be strongly supported. Building on the agency's solid record of air regulation over the last 4 decades, as well as the Supreme Court's 2007 decision upholding EPA's carbon regulatory authority. Regarding the second point, Michael Porter, a top Harvard economist and an economic policy advisor to the George W. Bush campaign, has been a champion of the view that well-designed and executed regulation can induce efficiency, spur technological innovation, and enhance competitiveness. What Porter calls the innovation effect makes processes and products more efficient and achieves savings sufficient to compensate for both the costs of compliance and the cost of innovation. Countries all over the world, from China to Germany to Japan, have committed to controlling carbon emissions through a variety of policy and investment mechanisms, and in doing so have grown a massive global clean energy industry measured in the trillions of dollars and millions of jobs that was once led by the U.S. We can abdicate this market by turning back the clock on carbon controls and related energy policy and investment, or we can seize the opportunity to lead the global clean energy industry, whether it's in nuclear power or renewable energy or advanced coal technologies or natural gas. We need look no further than China to see the clean energy technology industry, largely invented and once dominated by the U.S., slipping away. As we have dithered in our country in recent years in setting energy and climate policy, China has been working aggressively to become the world's clean energy powerhouse. The Chinese have set standards for power companies to produce more clean electricity, shut down old power plants and outdated heavy manufacturing capacity, established a program to improve the efficiency of its 1,000 most energy-consuming enterprises, invested heavily in energy R&D, provided low-cost financing for clean energy projects, made major investments in the electricity grid, and importantly, set a target to reduce carbon intensity 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2020. Beyond China, other countries including Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Denmark are forging ahead with ambitious clean energy policy and investment strategies and seeing significant job growth as a result. In contrast, the U.S. has largely stayed on the sidelines, endlessly debating the need for and approach to successful clean energy strategy. That's the bad news. The good news is that we can regain our leadership in clean energy. Among the solutions, we should adopt a national clean energy standard following the lead of many states that have set such standards. I would note that Congressman Barton and 16 of his Republican colleagues currently serving on the full committee supported an amendment to the American Clean Energy Security Act that included a detailed clean energy standard. We should increase our investment in energy R&D. We should support the DOE loan guarantee program that is proving pivotal in the deployment of clean energy technologies from renewables to nuclear. Over time, we should replace the DOE loan guarantee program with a new Clean Energy Deployment Administration that was adopted last year by the full House and by the Senate Energy Committee. We should extend federal tax credits that have been so vital in encouraging private sector financing of clean energy projects. And most relevant to this hearing, we should reject the proposal to withdraw EPA authority to regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. Mr. Chairman, I believe it is inevitable that we will put strong controls on greenhouse gas emissions. The question of U.S. carbon regulation is not whether, but when. And there is a significant increasing portion of the business community that agrees. A major reason they agree is that we have 4 decades of evidence that the federal government will implement carbon controls in a smart and cost-effective manner. For example, in 1990, power companies predicted that reducing sulfur dioxide to address the acid rain problem under the Clean Air Act would cost $1,000 to $1,500 per ton. In fact, the actual cost has been between $100 and $200 per ton. With regard to energy efficiency, as a result of a series of federal and state standards, a typical refrigerator today uses roughly a quarter of the electricity that it did in the 1970s and actually costs less in real terms. And with regard to automobile fuel economy, in early 2009, the administration reached an agreement with the auto industry, creating a single national program for fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions that will increase fuel economy levels in new passenger vehicles to 35.5 miles per gallon, save consumers roughly $3,000 over the life of a vehicle, drive fuel consumption in new vehicles down by 30%, and along with similar efforts globally, help lower oil demand and decrease oil prices, making us less vulnerable to oil price shocks from international events like those occurring as we speak in the Middle East. Wrapping up, prior to my current position at Stanford, I spent 4 years at Google. Coming from the energy sector, I was struck by how innovation, investment, and policy, with great leadership from the U.S. federal government, came together so effectively to build an entirely new game-changing and job-creating industry, the Internet, led by our nation. We must take a similar coordinated approach between the private sector and the U.S. government in order to seize the extraordinary opportunities in the next great industry, clean energy technology. If we don't get our act together between our government and the private sector, other countries that are taking the long view will be the winners of this marathon. A prize worth trillions of dollars and millions of jobs hangs in the balance. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Riker, and thank all of you for your testimony. You know, this testimony is so scintillating, really, because the perspectives on this issue are really diametrically opposed, which is what makes this so interesting. We're not going to get into science, and I'm going to read this one sentence, not for its truthfulness per se, but just as a view. Now, this was stated by Václav Klaus, President of the European Union, about this book, which is written by Ian Plimer, who has won Australia's highest scientific honor twice. And he says, this is a very powerful, clear, understandable, and extremely useful book. Plimer convincingly criticizes the United Nations, the International Panel for Climate Change, UK, US, and European Union politicians, as well as Hollywood show business celebrities. He strictly distinguishes science from environmental activism, politics, and opportunism. Now, like I said, I'm not talking about the truthfulness of that, but here's the issue. When you have that kind of different views on this very important subject, and Congress on 3 separate occasions has said no to EPA regulating greenhouse gases. And when Lisa Jackson appeared before this committee a couple of weeks ago, she was asked by Mr. Green of Texas, can we really address climate change without strong mandatory reductions by other major emitters in other countries? And Ms. Jackson said, we will not ultimately be able to change the amount of CO2 that is accumulating in the atmosphere alone. So, listening to you gentlemen, many of you, talk about the additional cost that would be imposed upon American businesses, and the fact that even Ms. Jackson herself has said there would not be any dramatic improvement in CO2 reductions. How do you draw this line? Mr. Carey, you said in your testimony that EPA has indicated that they would be closing down 14,000 megawatts of coal plants by 2011, 2012. Now, all of you are businessmen, but how, if you lose that kind of electricity, how do you make it up at a cost that does not increase the cost of American businesses? Can you answer that for me, Mr. Carey?
Mr. Chairman, I should be clear that the studies that I'm citing, there are several studies, and they all vary from about 75 gigawatts that would be lost under these proposals all the way down to 60 gigawatts. So that
gigawatts, okay.
Yeah, which also is 1,000 megawatts. So
yeah,
that's where we get the number from. But clearly, for our industry, when you are shutting down coal-based power-producing facilities, much like with the Clean Air Act, the rush was to put on clean coal technology, which at that time is scrubbers. What we're looking at now is the baseline of CO2 and the concept of carbon sequestration. So the ability for many of these power-producing facilities to actually meet the standard under a carbon sequestration standard and also ultimately be able to get the carbon dioxide to the facility, the technology, A, is not out, and ultimately what could happen and who is responsible for the carbon dioxide that goes into the ground.
Yeah.
So those numbers would reflect a tremendous drop in coal production.
Yeah.
And when you drop the amount of coals, as I stated before, Penn State said for every one coal job, up to 10 supporting jobs, the secondary jobs are due to that one coal job. You're looking at taking a number from anywhere of shutting down 77%.
Except for Mr. Riker, it seems like most of you agree that businesses would experience higher costs and there would be some job loss. Am I correct in that? Okay. Everybody says that. Mr. Riker feels like the green energy would create additional jobs. Mr. Montgomery,
That there are costs, but there are also benefits, and all
yeah. And how do you
measure.
determine what that line is? That's the real question.
That's where reasonable people will differ, and that's the essence of this debate.
Well, and I'm glad we're going to have Gina McCarthy with us today because she, according to EPA Air Chief Gina McCarthy, applying the 250 tons per year limit for greenhouse gases as mandated by Clean Air Act would require 6 million sources to obtain Title V permits, lead to 82,000 permitting actions under PSD, result in an estimated combined cost of $22.5 billion just to the permitting authorities, not to the businesses. So, and of course, I know they're depending on the tailoring rule, but a lot of people believe that tailoring rule will be ruled illegal. Well, I got off my message here, and I'm out of time. So, Mr. Rush, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Riker, how do you respond to the charge that many studies show that EPA's regulation of greenhouse gases will actually create jobs and stimulate growth in the economy are incomplete and give a distorted picture?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, Mr. Rush.
How do you respond to the charge that many studies show, the studies that show EPA's regulation of greenhouse gases will actually create jobs and stimulate growth in the economy, that they're incomplete and they give a distorted picture?
Mr. Rush, I'd look around the world where we're seeing a whole host of controls being put on carbon emissions, from China to the European Union, a whole host of other countries, where, in fact, the clean energy industries are taking off, jobs are being created in large numbers. So this has actually been a real net economic benefit in many respects to countries that have taken this initial step to begin to control carbon emissions.
Do you have any particular examples in mind that you can?
Germany is a great example, leading the world in so many energy technologies right now, and they have taken and put into effect a set of rigorous standards to control the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions over time, phasing those in. They have set and with that has come a very robust industry in a whole host of clean energy technologies, from advanced natural gas technologies to cogeneration to solar and wind, and to the extent that there are actually there's actually shortages of highly skilled employees for certain of the industries in that country.
Dr. Montgomery, you had some interesting remarks in your testimony. And you mentioned the peer report as an example of how some studies are incomplete and distorted in regards to the effects of the regulation on job creation. In fact, the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management looked at 4 of the most heavily regulated industries, which are pulp and paper, refining, iron and steel, and plastic, and estimated a net increase in employment of 1.5 jobs per $1 million in environmental spending over alternative expenditures. The same publication also found a net employment gain from environmental spending, noting that, and I quote, environmental protection has grown rapidly to become a major sales-generating, job-creating industry, $300 billion per year, and 5 million direct and indirect jobs in the year 2003, end of quote. Do you dispute those numbers? And if so, on what basis do you dispute them?
Actually, they make my point perfectly, that the environmental regulations increase the number of workers that have to be employed in an industry. They have to file forms, they have to operate pollution controls, and that adds to cost. Workers are a cost. It does not mention what happened to the output of those industries compared to what it would have been had they not been facing these costs. Yes, they have more workers per dollar of output, and they have less dollars of and they have less output because of the effects of higher prices, shifting demand away from those industries and into other substitutes, and shifting demand to other countries. Your second point, which I believe was that there are many jobs that are created in, well, you cited a number of jobs that are created in industries producing pollution control equipment. Absolutely, that's my point. And those workers are not available for producing other goods that actually go directly into the consumption and satisfaction of individuals. Those workers are not available for health care. Those workers are not available for producing automobiles. We are diverting resources away from other activities in the economy, and the study that you cited did not mention that in any way. Likewise,
so you would say then that if those same workers were not employed in the energy efficiency areas, then those workers would be at work selling cars and manufacturing cars and other industries. Is that what you're saying?
well, yes, that's clearly true in the long run. Absolutely. Our employment in this economy is determined by the available labor force, and aside from occasional recessions, we have done an extraordinarily good job under Democratic and Republican presidents of maintaining full employment, but it's a matter of macroeconomic policy, and you don't improve on that policy by imposing higher costs through environmental regulation. It's simply a different category of policy decisions. But for example, the Perry report, which claims to be talking about all of the total jobs that are going to be created in the economy, it said, well, yes, there are some offsetting job losses, the people who are going to be working in those coal-fired power plants that are being shut down. But it didn't mention all of the workers in the coal industry that were no longer going to be producing coal to go into the 60 or so gigawatts of coal-fired power plants.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
They absolutely left it out.
I want to ask you a follow-up question. Do you ever see any benefit in regulation to deal with pollution? Or is it all negative?
Absolutely. We have had tremendous benefits from many of the environmental regulations. We have seen air quality in Southern California. I lived in Pasadena for 8 years.
How about in the jobs?
Extraordinary.
In the jobs area?
No.
Sorry, we're about a minute and a half over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back to balance on my time.
Thank you for doing that. Mr. Barton is next, but it's my understanding with the...
I'm going to yield, I think, to Mr. Griffith.
Mr. Griffith, I understand you have a conflict on the floor, so we'll recognize you for
Or
5 minutes.
pass. I do want to ask questions, but I want to let him go first.
I thank you, gentlemen.
Without objection.
Pardon. I appreciate it. Mr. Riker, in your written statements, you indicated, in your oral statements as well, that China is well on its way to having a green or a more green energy-producing economy. And isn't it true, though, at this time that they actually produce more of their electricity with coal than we do in the United States?
They produce a very significant amount of their electricity with coal, absolutely. But they also have been growing their renewable energy industry in a very significant way and now lead the world in renewables, now lead the world in both solar and wind. They've also made huge strides in energy efficiency. They're a quickly growing country, as we know. No dispute that they use a lot of coal. But the important point is, they have an accelerating renewable energy industry that is really creating really large numbers of jobs.
Isn't it their history that they do a lot of things that we don't do? For example, I think in your written statement on page 3, you indicate that they have 27 nuclear power plants under construction. Is that accurate?
They have, yes, they have a large number of nuclear power plants under construction.
And you also indicated that they have a lot of hydroelectric facilities that are under construction or in plans. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And isn't it true that they pay a high price for those hydroelectric generated electricity at those plants?
Mr. Griffith, every energy technology, all of them have their pluses and minuses, and along with hydro, you get those.
Isn't it true that the Chinese have not paid attention anywhere near the level of the United States towards the environmental impact of so many of their facilities? And I'm thinking of their hydroelectric in particular, and the functional extinction of the Three River Gorge Yangtze river dolphin. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And that would be accurate, is it not?
There is no doubt that the development of these kinds of facilities bring with it environmental problems, and there is no doubt that the Chinese have not adequately attended to those in all cases. I've actually kayaked down those three gorges, and I know exactly what's there and what has been lost. Having said that, they have been making great strides to become leaders in renewable energy. They are making great strides to improve their energy efficiency, and there are increasing calls and I think increasing response to improve their environmental performance. But they've got a long way to go, no doubt about it. But from an economic standpoint, they are taking over this clean energy industry in a very significant way.
And from an economic standpoint, do you think it's appropriate that we adopt that model? Because I kind of got the impression you were holding them up as an example.
I'm holding them up as an example of a country that has put a real priority on clean energy technology research, demonstration, development, and deployment. I am not holding them up necessarily as a model for how you adequately ensure all kinds of environmental performance, but on that front, I think there are improvements, but they need to continue.
And isn't it true that we have different standards also on human rights, and that as a part of their hydroelectric program, they've actually moved 22 million people from one location to another and offered such rich financial rewards as $7 a month?
I don't know that at all. I'm sorry.
But you are aware, having kayaked that area, that millions just for the Three Gorges Dam project had to be moved.
I don't know the exact numbers. Certainly, there were large displacements of people, just as there have been all over the world, including in our own country, when dams get built. Let me not sit here today and tell you that hydropower is without its major environmental, human, and economic costs. All technologies, all energy technologies have their pluses and minuses, and there are significant ones that we know well in this country and that the Chinese are experiencing themselves with respect to hydropower.
And I like Mr. Montgomery's comments about the fact that they never take into consideration all the coal workers, and I wonder how you would address that, because it's not just the folks working at the power plants who work in coal, but it's all the folks who provide equipment for the coal mines, who make their livelihoods by supplying the miners themselves, and then of course the miners themselves. And in that economic equation that you have made, where you hold China up as an example, did you calculate in all the lost jobs that we would have in the energy field in this country, particularly in the coal fields?
There's always, again, got to be pluses and minuses. You've got to look at what comes with a move from one energy technology to the other. There is displacement. There are positives. There are negatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Mr. Waxman, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a panel of 7 people, 6 of whom underscore and confirm their views that are similar to the chair's, and then there's one who has a different opinion. And I thank you very much for letting this one witness testify. Yes. Mr. Barton was telling me how he always thought that the minority got a third of the witnesses. Nevertheless, Republicans are talking about EPA's onerous, burdensome regulations killing jobs. That's what this hearing is all about. But EPA is simply requiring, when it comes down to it, energy efficiency when the largest polluting facilities in the country are constructed or expanded and significantly increase their pollution. That's what the EPA regulations do. Mr. Riker, are energy efficiency improvements at new power plants, cement kilns, or the very largest manufacturing facilities going to kill jobs?
Mr. Waxman, I actually think improvements in energy efficiency at plants like this, number one, may keep them online longer than they would otherwise operate. Number two, the amount of equipment required to improve that efficiency will create jobs. Workers will continue to be employed. So I think on balance, if we do this the right way and actually improve the efficiency of existing power plants, this could be a very net positive economic outcome.
I must say, from my 36 years in the Congress, every time we've had an idea proposed to reduce pollution, the industry representatives all come in and say they'll be out of business, they can't function, the economy will suffer greatly. And then once the proposals are put into law, they accomplish the goal and they become even more efficient and therefore more competitive.
Mr. Waxman, if I could, Henry Ford II, commenting in 1966 on seatbelt and safety glass mandates for automobiles, said, "We'll have to close down the industry."
Well, it's
Seat
become
belts
almost
and safety glasses.
an article of faith among those who oppose any efforts to reduce our carbon pollution that China and the rest of the world aren't taking meaningful action to reduce their emissions, and they argue, why should we be doing anything that would disadvantage American companies if we take steps to reduce our own emissions? Is this an accurate statement? Is it true that China is taking no action to reduce carbon emissions?
China has committed to reduce its carbon intensity 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2020, and they are actually expected this month, in March, to make that a binding commitment domestically. So
Isn't it true that in China many of the people do not speak English? My next question is, China is not standing still. That's the kind of question of, isn't China bad on human rights and therefore we shouldn't do what they're doing on economic policy? Question then becomes, is China standing still? Are China's policies costing China jobs? Or are their carbon and clean energy policies driving Chinese firms to dominate the global market for clean energy technologies? What do you think, Mr. Riker?
You know, Mr. Waxman, it is not just that they are increasingly dominating in the manufacturing of these clean energy technologies, but in a way even scarier is how increasingly they're beginning to dominate in research, development, and demonstration. We see large American companies actually setting up their largest R&D facilities. Applied Materials Incorporated, one of the largest makers of solar equipment manufacturing in the world, is setting up a brand new R&D facility in China.
China is taking action to reduce its carbon pollution and to build strong, competitive, clean energy industries. And the results are massive job gains or massive job losses?
The Chinese renewable energy industry has grown fantastically in terms of jobs.
They're the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels. Their aggressive policies are in its economic self-interest. We may not agree with other things they do, and we're certainly not interested in their economic self-interest. We should be interested in our own. But they're acting in their economic self-interest. Mr. Riker, if we do nothing other than roll back EPA's modest steps to reduce carbon emissions, are we at risk of losing the clean energy jobs race with China?
Absolutely. We need to put in place a whole host of mechanisms to really regain the lead that we once had. We developed most of this industry. So, for example, I do think a clean energy standard makes a lot of sense to put in place. I also think we should support the DOE loan guarantee program, which has been so critical to building the next generation of nuclear power plants, building breakthrough renewable energy facilities, and we should transition that to the Clean Energy Deployment Administration that was adopted by the full House and in the Senate Energy Committee on a bipartisan basis last year.
Thank you.
Mr. Barton, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you. And it's a joy to watch the coordination between the ranking member and the ranking minority's witness. Is there any question that he didn't ask exactly the way you wanted it to ask, Mr. Riker? I'm sure we'll give him some more time if we need to do that.
Gentlemen, find fault with any of my questions?
No, I don't find fault. I just think it's a joy to watch the coordination. I think I think y'all handle that very well.
Yeah. I'm sure there's none with the other panelists.
I was giving you a compliment.
I'll accept it.
Very good.
Mr. Barton, I've been asked questions like this a lot, so this is fairly straightforward.
All right. Thank you. My question to anybody on the panel, unscripted, is there a control technology to control CO2 that's in existence today and is cost effective?
My understanding is there is not one.
Use the microphone.
Yeah, there is not one. What about Mr. Sissio? Are you aware of any control technology that exists to control CO2?
No, there's no end-of-pipe technology, though, that's cost-effective.
Okay. Mr. Riker, do you share that?
Well, the good news, Mr. Barton, is that yesterday, and this will be relevant to Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Rush, a major project was announced in Illinois that would build a carbon capture and sequestration facility under the Future Gen program.
I'm very aware of that.
$1 billion investment in the
Should be
project,
built.
1,000 construction jobs and 1,000 service sector jobs. So we're making good
in
progress.
and of itself, that technology is not cost effective. It costs at least 30% of the cost of the power generation just to sequester the carbon.
We've got a long way to go, no doubt. I guess the most cost effective one we have is probably trees.
Okay, so the answer is, if not unanimous consent, by consensus, is that there is no existing technology to control CO2. Therefore,
Yes, it's nuclear power.
well,
You're talking about capturing CO2. There's plenty of ways
you have a
to
lot more.
reduce
you
CO2.
can burn hydrogen. Hydrogen doesn't create, that if you burn hydrogen, you get H2O, you get water vapor. Nuclear power does not combust; it fissions. So there are technologies out there, but if you're going to use natural gas, if you're going to use oil, if you're going to use coal, if you're going to use even our famous biomass here, you're going to create CO2, and there's no cost-effective way currently to mitigate it.
One way to reduce CO2 emissions in our industry, the automobile industry, is to have one national standard, CAFE, that Congress put into place that takes in consideration cost. We have to sell these things. It may cost $1 billion somewhere, but ultimately what I'm the expert on is selling fuel-efficient cars. Since I was 16, and right now we have 3 agencies, California, EPA, trying to tell us all what to do. We need one because they're the only one that take into consideration customer acceptability and choice. And it doesn't do the economy any good or jobs. Auto dealers employ 1 million people in this country. If you have a product that sits on the lot that doesn't sell because it's not priced right, there are many businesses that have been shuttered down and gone broke because they're not giving the customer what they want. And so that's the reason that our organization would like to see CAFE implemented.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure what my time, I never saw the clock start or stop.
Well, I'm going to ask the official timekeeper here.
Do I have time for one more question? Because I know
Unanimous consent, the gentleman be given 2 additional minutes.
Without objection.
Be careful, my side may object to that. Yeah, these unanimous consent things are shaky sometimes. Well, I have one final question. I appreciate my friend from California and the chairman giving me some time. Administrator Jackson has testified that greenhouse gas best available technology most likely means that you just have to use energy efficiency measures. Mr. Sissio, you represent the largest energy users in America. Don't the companies that you represent already do everything they can to be energy efficient?
Well, most certainly the industrial sector spends more money and has had more success in improving energy efficiency than any of the sectors of the economy. In this case, the EPA really has it backward. When a manufacturer decides, by the way, if you're not aware, manufacturing has probably hundreds of thousands of combustion processes that are used to produce widgets. When we make decisions on what process is used to make a widget, we take several things into consideration, like how many widgets can we produce in a time period? What is the cost of a widget? What is the raw material flexibility to produce the widget? What is the quality of the product with that process? What is the flexibility of the manufacturing operating process? There's all that criteria in deciding what process, plus energy efficiency. How energy efficient is the process? EPA, unfortunately, with the new regulation, starts with the premise of what is the most energy efficient process. And that is not going to create a low-cost manufacturing widget process. That is too limiting, and it's going to lead to higher costs.
I thank the discretion of the chairman
Thank you.
and the ranking member.
Mr. Green, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I believe that controlling carbon shouldn't be EPA. The Supreme Court said that. I want Congress to be able to make those decisions because we can balance that economics. And we tried last Congress. It couldn't get through with the cap and trade. I would hope our committee would look at it. That's why I'm a co-sponsor of the 2-year delay, so we will force Congress to deal with it. Although the solution may be just to encourage trees, but we'd probably have to go to the Natural Resources Committee to do that. Mr. Ciccio, in May of 2010, the EPA finalized a tailoring rule, and until June 30th of this year, only sources subject to the prevention of significant determination for other pollutants will be required to consider greenhouse gases in the permit. From July 1st of 2011 to June 30th of 2013, new sources that emit at least 100,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year or existing sources seeking to increase pollution by 75,000 tons per year will be required to obtain the PSD permits. The EPA will determine on July 1st of 2012 whether it will lower the threshold further, but it has committed that it will not consider any level below 550,000 tons a year. Can you please cite how many industrial manufacturers in our country are affected by regulations at each of these three levels? 100,000 tons of GHGs a year, 75,000 or 50. Do you have any idea from your association? I mean, I represent 5 refineries, so I can.
Oh, yeah. You have a lot of them right in your backyard. Unfortunately, I don't have those statistics, and I'd be happy to try to craft something for you and provide that to you.
I'd appreciate it because our testimony from Administrator Jackson a few weeks ago was that they tailored it so it will only cover the largest facilities, right, and just see how many. And granted, they're trying to start with the largest, so to see how many were, and appreciate you getting it back. What sort of federal carbon controlling program, if developed by Congress and not the EPA, could the industrial manufacturer support?
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful question. We've actually addressed that in our what we call our Sustainable Manufacturing Growth Initiative, because as manufacturers, we put together policies that we felt would incentivize and remove regulatory barriers to even greater energy efficiency. And as you heard in my testimony, implementation of that program would result in 10% reduction of all greenhouse gas emissions in 10 years. And even more importantly, it would create 3.2 million man-years of jobs and almost $500 billion of capital investment in 10 years. That's capital investment that's not happening today. So the best thing is that it utilizes existing but more energy-efficient technology and simply taking it off the shelf and getting it in the ground today, creating jobs and investment.
Well, and I don't know who answered our former chair of the committee, a ranking member, that said nuclear would be the solution for some of our carbon controls, and we're trying to do that because that's one of the solutions, because so much of our carbon comes from our electricity producing plants. Again, I have those plants. I have coal plants, but I also have refineries and chemical plants that have another issue. So, but I think Congress ought to make those decisions. Mr. McConnell, California's fuel economy program exempts until 2016 automakers who sell less than 60,000 vehicles per year in California. Manufacturers exempt in California are also exempt in every CARB state, regardless of how many vehicles are sold outside California. After 2016, CARB's intended to regulate these vehicles at a lower standard. If the brands you sell are not exempt, how will that impact on your brand line? Because I know you both have Honda, Acura, and then I think you have a U.S. model too, although Honda is also a U.S. model too.
Well, first of all, we believe the state of California should not be setting national energy policy.
Coming from Texas, I agree.
So I appreciate your question. I will tell you, you're absolutely right, and I don't think some people realize it. So in Honda, we are under the California, which is just a hodgepodge. There are 3 different people regulating. What we want is one, CAFE, which Congress laid out, single national standard. For example, you're right, Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Ford, Chrysler, GM are covered. BMW is covered. Mercedes is not covered. Hyundai's not covered. Kia's not covered. Porsche is not covered. Volkswagen's not covered. Jaguar's not covered. Suzuki, Mitsubishi, I could go on. And potential that new Chinese and Indian automakers would not be covered. That's why under CAFE, they don't have all these crazy exemptions. So we want the one national standard. It takes, the most important thing to me, it takes in accountability. They are required that the EPA is not, California is not, customer acceptability and choice. Because ultimately, the customer is the one that spends his own, the family decides, hey, what do I want? What can I afford? And if that's in the case, you'll sell more new cars, create more jobs, and you also get more fuel-efficient cars on the road, which is obviously a big goal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
And
Mr.
that
Chairman?
gavel's for us not to ask you more questions, not for y'all.
Mr. Chairman, could you recognize 5 minutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This kind of follows up in a hearing we had 2 weeks ago on the environment and the economy as my subcommittee. But we have to accept the fact that the decisions we make or the decision that regular makes, that there's a job aspect that people ought to debate and discuss. And I come to this with great passion because, and many of you have seen this before, Mr. Carey, you have, Mr. CCO, you've seen. This is why we killed Waxman-Markey, because we made the argument that in '92 on the Clean Air Act, which was a legitimate debate on cleaning the air, these miners lost their jobs. This is just one group of miners at a mine in my congressional district, which is closed now. 1,000 miners lost their jobs. And by using this, and the reality is there's a lot of fossil fuel Democrats no longer in Congress. You know why? Because they didn't protect their jobs. Because the greenhouse gas movement, the Waxman-Markey, threatened to destroy any remaining jobs. Mr. Carey, we've testified before, how many coal miner jobs were lost in the advent of the Clean Air Act?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Shimkus, the idea in Ohio, and I think when I testified before, we looked at the amount of tonnage of coal, we lessened it by half, take away half that miners. Those were roughly 3,000 miners, multiplier effect of close to 10,000, or 10 for every one coal mining job.
So your stats were 35,000 jobs were lost. And that was in the Clean Air Act, which a lot of us would say, NOx, SOx, particulate matter, some bad stuff that we really needed to get out of the air. There is now a debate about greenhouse gases. And is it a pollutant? Is it not? And that's why we need to move on this legislation to let us to take into the aspect of what's the cost, what's the impact on the economy. Why are we so fired up about this? Well, here's just one rule from the EPA on RCRA, and they're quoted, the RIA for this proposed rule does not include either qualitative or quantitative estimation of the potential effects of the proposed rule on economic productivity, economic growth, employment, job creation, or international economic competitiveness. Now, Mr. Carey, don't you think we ought to consider that when we're promulgating a rule or a regulation?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman, yes.
Mr. CCO?
Absolutely.
Mr. Joyce?
Yes.
Mr. McConnell?
Without question.
Mr. Montgomery?
Yes.
Mr. Riker? Do you think the EPA is wrong in not considering the economic impact of a proposed rule?
EPA is required to consider the economic impact of a proposed rule.
This is from the EPA,
well,
and I just read the quote.
They've got to be economically feasible.
Let me just go to another one. Economic analysis on another proposed EPA rule. Let me read in paragraph 9.2.3. 3, impacts on employment. The chapters on benefits, Chapter 7, and cost, Chapter 8, point out that the regulatory-induced employment impacts are not, in general, relevant for a cost-benefit analysis.
So, Mr. Shimkus, I would just urge you to take a look at the Clean Air Act sections, the 3 sections that relate to.
Well, I've already, and I'm going to reclaim my time. I'm going to defer. I'm going to reclaim my time, sir. Sir, I'm going to reclaim my time. My point is, the Clean Air Act, we're not disputing NOx, SOx, particulate matter. We do dispute carbon dioxide. Now, I have a 1,600 megawatt. Does everyone agree that if you raise the price of a commodity product, that the cost of goods sold goes up?
Yes.
See, yes, CCO?
Absolutely.
Mr. McConnell, Mr. Joyce, Mr. Montgomery, Ms. Riker?
Ask the question again.
I asked Administrator Jackson if she really believed in the basic economic 101, supply and demand. If the supply is constrained or the cost of the good goes up, does that mean that the price of the cost of the good goes up?
Well, if you have to use the same amount of that good in the product, if you can improve
that was a better answer than the administrator gave, and I appreciate
you can improve
that.
the efficiency of the manufacturing process,
and which they do. That's the whole debate that Mr. Cicio will say. It's not worth the manufacturer's time, effort, and energy to run inefficient plants. Now, and let me end. I'm going to run out of time. Mr. Cicio, you said you don't know of a single manufacturer that would not be harmed by greenhouse gas and would lose jobs. Is that your quote?
What I said specifically is that I talked to many manufacturers that have facilities all over the country. I do not know, have not heard of one that support the EPA greenhouse gas regulations. Yes, sir.
Thank you. You're back.
Mr. Walden, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask, I think it's Mr. Carey, and anybody else who wants to respond, walk us through what you think the cost of these regulations are on jobs and the economy in your part of this debate. Because this is something I think people at home care a lot about. I mean, none of us wants dirty air. Most of us in my part of the world in Oregon like renewable energy as long as we kind of know what the costs and trade-offs are, although some people get a little tired of the windmills. But go ahead.
Congressman, I think what we're debating is carbon dioxide and the role of the EPA in regulating carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. So if we take that off the table, if you look at Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, in Ohio, 90%, 89% of all the electricity off of the grid comes from coal base. So when you relate that to heavy manufacturing, anybody who is making a widget understands that one of the large costs of making that widget is energy. So
power, right.
Ultimately, the price of that product would go up, and if it goes up, possibly that product's production would be moved overseas, and ultimately then we would lose the job there.
Yeah, we're seeing in the Northwest as some of the renewable energy begins to feed in to the system, rate increases of 10, 15%. As sort of the cost, the additional cost. Now, these are benefit trade-offs we're talking about here because you've got the renewable energy, but there is this cost piece.
No doubt about it, Congressman. What was put in place in Ohio was Advanced Energy Portfolio Standard.
Right.
And ultimately what you're seeing now is those utilities can't meet the cost cap that was put in place by the state legislature. So the idea that the price is going to go up with those renewables is a fact, and it's happening.
Mr. Cicio?
Yeah, on the subject of cost of regulation, number one, for those who want to invest in the United States in a manufacturing facility to create jobs, a rule like this is preventing investment. So these are jobs that could have been and won't. Manufacturing is globally mobile. We must produce in countries where we can have low costs and thrive, or we die as a company. But for manufacturing facilities that stay and have these higher costs, then their competitiveness is threatened, and the potential for job loss and plant shutdown.
Mr. Joyce?
And in the permitting process, just adding another layer of permits, you've got, local and state permits. When we were, as the tailoring bleeds off and more buildings come under the control of EPA and
right.
more permits, I mean, a federal permit, any federal work is daunting for smaller projects. So we have just great concern over the additional permitting and the construction side of the house. And what we think is a lot of good projects is probably the straw that breaks the camel's back. They just don't get done. So those are huge costs. They're huge costs to jobs and job creation in the construction sector.
And are those ever quantified? I mean, the project that never gets built probably never gets any press, so you don't know the loss, right?
There's soft costs, and you know, any type of a labor, paperwork intensive permitting process on a construction job is bad right now and anytime.
Okay. Mr. McConnell, do you want to comment on this?
One of the biggest problems that we have, because California has a waiver, they don't even have to consider affordability outside of California.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, California has the ability, if they control 14 other states have signed up with them on, so if they decide that they don't want to participate in the national program,
Right.
Go along, and they take their ball and they go play with somebody else, then what happens is they do not have to consider how much it costs outside of the state. They only have to consider, they're only looking at the state of California, not even these other 14 states. And the problem with that is it results in a rationing of vehicles, but the cost, you've got 3 different people. You've got to know some certainty in the automobile business to design cars in the
Right.
future, how much cost is, and they don't even have to consider, EPA does not even have to consider customer acceptability. So they could stack on the cost, but quite frankly, that is the problem, and that's the reason you need to go back and enforce one national standard that this body had for fuel economy.
I want to try and get to the other two. Mr. Montgomery, I'm running out of time.
I think the answer really comes down to there's no such thing as a free lunch. That in our economy we have every incentive is for energy efficiency, using energy wisely, and minimizing the cost of production. That's not true in China, and that's why China can catch up so easily. And since there is no free lunch, if we are expending more of our resources on expensive energy like renewables, they're not available for producing the other things that people desire to live on and have quality of life.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Appreciate that.
Mr. Terry. Your first name's Lee, right? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate you being here, even though you referenced the cafe process.
But I was aware of the name.
But that was a great process because it involved the already existing set agency that has the expertise in determining fuel efficiency in a very scientific way. Not political way. And it was a byproduct of Congress signed into law by the president. That was very carefully crafted, pushing the automobile industry as far as we could take it, keeping in mind safety, keeping in mind the desire to keep jobs in America and the car industry. And so that's probably part of my discussion I'll have with the EPA representative of why the administration, the EPA, now wants to duplicate, replace, undo what Congress did.
Well, we certainly appreciate it. I will say that the EPA is wasting millions of taxpayers' dollars on duplicating NHTSA's research in fuel economy for tailpipe emissions.
It's probably creating a job.
It's going to cost a lot of jobs.
Well, and you had mentioned the California that you and Mr. Walden discussed, but there was a statement by one of the members that there's one national standard, but yet that's not what I hear, and that doesn't seem to be what EPA is fighting for. Would you explain?
Yes, they're regulated by. There's 3 agencies, 3 laws, and 3 rules, and they've termed this. I guess it's a pretty nifty thing they did was they called 3 different standards one national program. I mean, it's a fiction. You have the correct one national program, and that is CAFE. And it is implemented by NHTSA.
Yeah.
It takes into account...
How does that affect the car dealers and auto manufacturing in the United States?
Well, first of all, to me, one of the biggest things is you can't have one state setting the national standard. But it affects us because I buy the cars from the manufacturer. They don't consign them to me. I have these cars on my lot. If they are not, if you don't take into consideration, which your plan does, CAFE does, customer acceptability and choice, because the customer is the one that makes the decision. They have a choice. They can keep riding in that car they've got and work on it. I mean, we're super busy in our shop because that's what people have done after the recession. So, but it costs a lot of money and it's a lot of duplication. You know, when you're in business and you're planning, what you need is clear, concise guidance. And I believe that one national standard under CAFE with NHTSA implementing with all the safeguards, I think you will get the CO2 reductions. You'll get to the goal, but you'll get to a goal that's
part of our
realistic
goal
for the marketplace also.
All right, I appreciate that. One last question to Dr. Montgomery, because I felt like I was in an alternative universe when we were having a discussion about green jobs and how great a job that China's doing in manufacturing all this equipment. But the reality is it's being manufactured over there because it's inefficient to manufacture it in the United States, where it was designed and engineered. You answered that or brought that up in your report. Would you expand on that? Do you think it's true that China's just doing this altruistically?
No, in fact, I think there are probably 2 or 3 points about China. The first one being, it's ironic because 2 weeks ago I was testifying in the Senate hearing on green jobs, where one of the witnesses was from the Steelworkers Union, which had filed the 301B trade complaint against China's internal subsidy practices, which were enabling it to produce the wind and solar and other equipment that is now being used around the world and in the United States, and preventing U.S. firms from getting in there. So what we're looking at is not environmental policy for China. It's strategic trade policy, as it has always been. And do we want to imitate that? Well, if China is in violation of the WTO for subsidizing its industries, we would be as well. But the real point about all of that has nothing to do with environmental regulation. China is not creating those industries by making its own country clean. It's creating them by subsidizing their exports, as it has always done to create industries. And I think the other point about China is that China has a set of institutions, and I've been writing about this for years, that lead China to have, in the past, 5 times the energy use per dollar of output as the United States. That's coming down. But it's coming down because it is so hideously inefficient. It's in their economic interest to do it. We have a well-functioning set of markets here, and we don't have that free lunch.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. Unfortunately, we have votes on the floor. We have 3 more, and then that's it for the day. But before we go, Dr. Burgess, I'm going to recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Montgomery, just to stay with you for a moment, we're going to hear on the next panel testimony about the health hazards of carbon dioxide. And do higher energy prices carry with them any inherent health risk vis-a-vis keeping open medical offices, health centers, and this type of thing? Does that affect the availability of medical care or health care?
Yes, it does. And it's really a problem that EPA refuses to do risk-on-risk analysis in this area. If we're going to look at risks from greenhouse gas emissions, those are highly speculative, highly uncertain, and anything we do in the United States will have only a minuscule effect on them. Carbon dioxide is not like ozone. I mentioned ozone in Pasadena. Ozone in Pasadena was created in Beverly Hills, blew across, and ended up in Pasadena, and it produced tremendous health effects. Greenhouse gas emissions are mixed in the entire atmosphere, and we're not going to change them through these regulations in a way that's even worth bothering to try to calculate unless we assume all the rest of the world does what we're doing. And that's what EPA tends to do. But they're not. And so there's a small health benefit from actions that we actually take in the United States. But on the other side of it, you are absolutely right. Higher energy costs make air conditioning harder for people to afford. We know that the lack of air conditioning has been the primary reason for deaths during heat episodes in Chicago and other places. And it takes a risk-on-risk analysis, which EPA did not do in determining that on balance the health risk justified the standards.
Yeah, of course, I've suffered from asthma myself, and I know what triggers there are. I try to avoid them as best I can, but I've never associated carbon dioxide with an asthma trigger. It just doesn't work out medically. So I appreciate your comments in that regard. On the you talked a little bit about some of the multiplier effects. Is there a way to apply the multiplier effect in reverse to this type of situation?
It's interesting. There is a valid way to do it, and I think the work that Jorgensen and Wilcoxon have been doing, asking how do health effects of criteria pollutants that cause asthma affect worker productivity, and they put that into their large kind of assessment of not greenhouse gas regulations, but the past Clean Air Act regulations like the SOx and ozone regulations that clearly had health benefits. There is a way to bring it, and in terms of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, it really isn't applicable because what we are talking about are health effects that are dominated by temperature changes in tropical latitudes that lead to increased kind of vector populations that cause malaria and such diseases. So it's a global public health problem, but the solution for it is global public health measures. For example, going back to DDT, we could wipe out the malaria vector no matter what the temperature was.
I see.
So there is an ironic point about multiplier analysis, because if you do the kind of multiplier analysis that Perry is doing, they argue quite explicitly over and over again that the reason they're getting increased jobs is because greenhouse gas policies favor labor-intensive industries, and they put more people to work that way. Well, if we had a lot of illness in the country, then businesses would have to hire more workers to hire to replace their workers who were sick in order to get the same level of output. And so if you applied their multiplier, you would get the ridiculous conclusion that poor health actually increases jobs. It's not a reasonable conclusion, but what you get out of that kind of a multiplier analysis.
Dr. Reichert, let me ask you a question if I could. You were at Google previously? Did I understand that correctly? And when you were there, did your company ask the Chinese government to institute the type of greenhouse gas reductions like the cap and trade proposal that we had before this committee 2 years ago?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
When you were at Google, did Google ask the Chinese? Did your company, Google, ask the Chinese government to institute any type of mandatory greenhouse gas reductions, such as would have been required under the Waxman-Markey legislation that we debated in this committee 2 years ago?
I don't think the company's in the position to...
Well, you support, or at least I got the impression that you support a cap-and-trade type proposal in this country. Did you ever ask the Chinese government to institute a cap-and-trade proposal?
I did not ask the Chinese government to institute a cap-and-trade proposal. I'm in favor of comprehensive energy and climate legislation. There are a whole host of means to get there, and I think we should get started for economic reasons and for security reasons and for environmental reasons.
But you and Google at no time insisted that the Chinese government follow the same type of protocol that has been advocated.
Again, I was not in conversations with the Chinese government about greenhouse gas regulation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Well, once again, I apologize to you all. I hope that you maybe would be able to stay another 10 minutes or so. We have 3 votes on the floor. I don't think it'll take long. We'll be right back. Hopefully, I think most of our members will be back that haven't asked questions. So we look forward to seeing you in a few minutes. Okay, call the hearing back to order, and at this time I'll recognize Mr. Gardner of Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everyone for putting up with the schedule today. Appreciate your time and certainly your expertise. A couple of weeks ago, we had Administrator Lisa Jackson of the EPA testify before the subcommittee. And I want to read a quote that she had in our dialogue. She said, and I quote, "There are tremendous opportunities in rural America for the economy to continue to grow as it has thrived over the past several years." This was just a couple of years ago as the economy, in her belief, her opinion, has thrived over the past couple of years. So when I asked her to clarify and whether she really meant the economy has thrived over the past several years, her response, again, and I quote, was, "Rural America's economy has done fairly well as the rest of the country has seen the housing market and economy really do poorly." Well, in 17 out of the 64 counties in Colorado, they had a population decline, all of them rural, most of them rural. In many of the counties in my district, they have lost population. And I'm quite disturbed, actually, that the nature of the assertion made by Administrator Jackson really shows how out of touch the administrator is when it comes to the economic well-being of my state, my district, and this country. Wanted to get your thoughts quickly on what is happening to our economy and economic policies in this nation when it comes specifically to some of the testimony that was given today, some of the statements that were made. Wanted to, find it here. Some of the questions have been offered a little bit about the nature of regulations, the impact of those regulations, and what it means for our rural economies in particular. Do you think the greenhouse gas regulations will impact our rural economies? Mr. Kerry.
Congressman, yes, I do. There's no doubt about it. The greenhouse gases directly affect jobs.
Mr. Ciccio.
Some of my companies are fertilizer producers. About 75% of the cost of making fertilizer is the cost of natural gas. And these regulations would indeed increase energy costs.
Mr. Joyce.
Yes, we would see it across the board, particularly with the farmers in the livestock sector.
Mr. McConnell.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Mr. Montgomery.
Yes, I'd agree with both that the costs of agricultural inputs are going to go up, and that cattle is probably going to be suffering both because it uses other grains. And I think the other part of this is that the EPA regulations are not really, I don't see a way that they are going to include activities like sequestration and other farm-based activities that could potentially be profitable as a way of providing offsets for greenhouse gas emissions under a broader and more comprehensive policy.
Mr. Riker.
Some of those impacts will be positive and some of them will be negative. If you're in the wind business, it could be quite positive. If you're in the natural gas business, it could be quite positive.
What if you're in farming? You grow crops.
It all depends on what you're farming. The opportunities around biomass for power, for fuels are very significant. And so, again, like so many of the answers to so many of these questions today, Mr. Gardner, it depends on the specifics.
Mr. Ciccio, a statement by the EPA was made earlier that said, when it was talking about EPA's authority to control carbon emissions, that bill would deprive American industry of investment certainty and new incentives for upgrading to advanced clean energy technologies. Do your members feel deprived and that they're not willing to make investment because of this regulation, the lack of this regulation?
No, I've not heard anyone say that.
Thank you. And Mr. Riker, interested in your comments on nuclear power, and I believe you talked about the need to actually improve energy permitting projects, or also nuclear power permitting. What specifically do you think we could do to increase the presence of nuclear power development and to improve energy project permitting and siting?
Well, Mr. Gardner, I think one of the challenges that advanced nuclear faces, advanced renewables face, a whole host of these technologies face, is how you get the first large-scale commercial plant financed and built in this country. It's fairly straightforward to get the little prototype built. Venture capital.
Financed is different than permitting. You specifically said permitting.
Well, there's two things. One is we've got to get those first-of-a-kind commercial plants built. That's where I think the Clean Energy Deployment Administration and its ability to finance.
But on nuclear power, what can we do for permitting?
Permitting, there is
issue them.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has taken quite a look at ways to streamline permitting. I don't know the details of the changes they proposed, but there are a whole host of things. But you're not going to get them built if you can't get them financed, and that's the real issue at this point.
Do you think we should include hydropower as part of a clean energy standard?
I think a clean energy standard should be very broad. It should include all the renewables. It should include energy
Including
efficient-
hydropower?
Yes, including hydropower.
Mr. Inslee, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to ask Mr. Reichert about the public's belief about this issue of whether or not we should stop the federal government from doing its job. There's basically an effort here, which is pretty incredible to me, to tell the Environmental Protection Agency that it can't enforce the provisions of the Clean Air Act, which is like telling the FBI they can't arrest terrorists, or cops that they can't arrest bank robbers. We are intentionally, folks around here want to intentionally disable the ability of the government to do its statutorily mandated job. To me, that's pretty amazing. So I wondered what the American people thought of that, and we did a little looking. The people I talk to where I live in the state of Washington certainly don't think, by huge majorities, the people I talk to don't think that's a very good idea to tell the federal government it can't do its job, to intentionally shackle it, put its handcuffs on, and let the polluters pollute. So to check out whether I'm just talking to the wrong people, I did a little research and into what the polling would disclose Americans think. It was pretty timely because a poll came out by the Public Policy Polling and NRDC just the other day. It showed that 68% of Americans were opposed to delaying EPA reducing carbon pollution by enormous majority, 68 to 32%. It's hard to get 68% of Americans to agree that baseball is the American sport, but we got 68% of Americans. Then you look at, if you do it on a more granular level, I saw another poll done by, I believe, the Sustainable Business, well, I've read about it at sustainablebusiness.com, of 19 congressional districts asking a very similar question after asking both sort of arguments on both sides of this very fair poll showed that in 19 congressional districts represented by Republicans, in those Republican districts, 66% of people, including 45% of Republicans and 62% of independents, found that they didn't want the EPA to be disabled. There's a third poll. I don't have the results right in front of me, but very similar results by almost 2-to-1 margins. Americans didn't want to disable the federal government from doing its job to reduce pollution. Now, I have some theories as to why Americans believe that. I think it's because Americans are optimistic and know that we can do innovations and create new jobs associated with these new ways of reducing pollution. But Mr. Reichert, I just wondered if you wanted to express thoughts about why you think Americans feel so strongly that people are out to lunch who want to disable the federal government here.
Well, Mr. Inslee, I think it starts with the fact that there is a basic understanding that climate is going to have serious impacts on human health and the environment. When you start with that presumption, as we did with all the other sort of pollutants we've been dealing with, that motivates people to end up saying, we want our government to take action. I'd go from there to say the Supreme Court said, figure out whether carbon's a pollutant. EPA took that, figured out that it was, and said, what are we supposed to do when it's determined to be a pollutant? We're supposed to go out and begin to put some controls on it. So I think the public recognizes that we're dealing with a serious risk. The Supreme Court has weighed in, the relevant agency has weighed in, plus, and this is important, our investment community, Wall Street and Silicon Valley, has said, figure this out. If you want money to stay in this country for clean energy investments, figure out whether or not you're going to be regulating this. Figure out whether you're going to put energy standards in place, pollution standards in place to deal with this carbon. As long as we're not going to make that decision, we're going to see massive amounts of capital flow to other countries where they have made that decision.
So let me suggest one more reason huge majorities of Americans think it's a bad idea to disable the EPA. Business people believe this. In the last week, I've had 2 business groups in the state of Washington come to me and tell me what climate change is doing to their business. The people who grow oysters and clams, their industry, their industrial model is at risk today because of ocean acidification associated with carbon dioxide pollution. They want a solution to this problem. They're losing their industry in the west coast of the United States. This is a long-time industry that is important in Puget Sound, where I come from. This morning I had the berry growers from the Northwest come to me and tell me that 50% of the, actually it was grapes, were essentially lost because of, it's either a fungus or a bacteria associated with changes in climate, they believe, and they were asking me for help to solve this problem. If we don't deal with this problem, we're going to lose jobs. This is a job creation engine like China gets, so we don't. And I hope we'll wake up in the next 4 seconds. And thank you, Mr. Riker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. Inslee. This time recognize Mr. Bilbray, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. You made a reference to CARB. And frankly, I served 6 years on CARB. You made a reference to the Air Resources Board in California. I served 6 years there, 10 years on Air District, 2 stints as chairman. And I'd like to remind you that it was California that told Washington in 1992 that the mandate that methanol was put in our fuel stream was not an environmental option. It was environmentally damaging. So Washington sometimes gets it wrong. And we pointed out that people who claim to be environmentalists in Washington aren't necessarily going to pencil out in the long run. And I think that experiment history is going to show is a major, major mistake. And I just wish the people that were so self-righteous then will now look around and say, maybe we ought to try to get our science down first before we start making claims. And I think MTBE and the methanol in the fuel line, has been proven again and again that the so-called experts then in Washington, D.C. were behind us at CARB. But if I could propose to you, if the federal government could pass a law today that would improve your fuel mileage and reduce your emissions by 22.6%, what would be your industry's response to that?
Well, I don't represent the manufacturers.
But as someone who's selling the product.
Well, I believe that California should have a voice, but no more than any other state. Provide data, political clout that they have. But we feel like that we don't have a problem with reducing CO2 emissions.
Okay,
I'm not.
Let me interrupt you. Look, Mr. McConnell, if I could tell you again that I have a study that shows 22.6% reduction in emissions and fuel mileage, and it will not cost 1 cent to produce a car, 1 more cent to produce a car. If I could show you that study, would you be willing to say maybe we ought to consider implementing these mandates if it doesn't cost 1 more cent to produce an automobile in this country?
I would be happy to look at the study. What needs to happen, though, is CAFE is laid out.
Let me get CAFE. Let's get a CAFE. Are you talking 100% fossil fuel? Are you talking CAFE standards with 10% ethanol? Are you talking 10% algae fuel? What fuel mixture here? Because we have a lot of fuel mixtures here. And that is one thing when we talk about CAFE, that the renewable fuel mandate has actually reduced the ability for automobiles to get mileage, something that nobody wants to talk about in this town. Let me go over to you, Mr. Riker. Mr. Riker, if we could mandate 22.6% more fuel efficiency and emissions, wouldn't you say that is something that we should be looking at, especially if we claim we're in a crisis?
Sounds like a smart way to proceed, Mr.
The problem is what it does, it's not a mandate on the private sector, it's a mandate on government. Traffic management, inappropriate traffic management. Every time you stop at a 4-way stop, you remember you're polluting 5 times more than if you were allowed to roll through with a yield sign. And this town's quick at pointing fingers at you and your industry. But those of us in government will walk away from something that studies have shown can be major breakthroughs. But because it's easier to be against the business community and not the other way. And as somebody who's worked on these issues for decades, I'm frustrated with the people that come out of Washington claiming that they're going to save the world by turning corn into fuel, or taking methanol and converting it over and not looking at the longer impact. And I'm sorry, I hear you attack CARB. The CARB that I see today coming out is a political extension. Our scientists are pretty darn good. One of the things our scientists want to talk about is, Mr. Riker, last I checked with the UN, the Chinese economy was about 1/10 of our economy, right?
I don't know the statistics.
Okay. Well, let's just say this. China is implementing 20 nuclear power plants. We're implementing 2.
Does that, well, let me just say on that, I'll give you that number. And the Executive Secretary of the UN National Framework and Convention on Climate Change says he has not seen a credible scenario that does not have nuclear as a major part of their mixture. In fact, even the report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that states that a robust mix of energy sources, including nuclear, must be included. Now, do you believe that 2 out of an industry that's 10 times as big as China is a robust commitment to implementing clean air strategies with nuclear power?
Mr. Bilberry, I came in and testified in my opening statement that we should adopt a clean energy standard that includes most of these technologies, including nuclear.
Wait, Mr. Chairman, I asked for one more minute on this item, please. I just follow up.
Yeah,
Mr. Riker, the state of California does not allow nuclear power today, and my colleagues at the ARB are not allowed to implement a robust nuclear program while we're talking about the climate being in crisis. My concern is my colleagues in California claim they care about the environment and are willing to attack the private sector, but are not willing to do things like force government to change the way it operates so we clean up our act. Your comment on that?
In that regard, I would urge you to take a careful look at a national clean energy standard, because it could deal with some of these inconsistencies that we have state to state over a whole range of technologies. That's one way to proceed. If you're bothered by the inconsistency state to state, take a look at what Mr. Barton supported in the amendments last year.
Wouldn't you agree that it's one thing to give a loan guarantee, it's another thing not to allow it to be permitted, for government to outlaw it? In fact, let me say this as somebody who's worked on environmental regs. We talk about a Manhattan Project for energy independence in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, the Manhattan Project would not be legal under existing law. You couldn't even cite the test site because of Endangered Species Act. That's the kind of barrier that those of us in Washington who want to address this crisis have to be willing to stand up and address. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's recognize the gentleman, Mr. Olson from Texas, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. Joyce, my first question is for you. At the first, I want to thank you for being part of the economic engine that drives America, small business.
It's my pleasure.
In your testimony, you said that the environmental regulations have cost your family business upwards of $150,000. How many more people could you hire if you didn't have that excessive cost? And more importantly, how many of your current jobs are at risk right now if greenhouse gas regulations become law?
We could hire 2 additional people if we weren't doing those tasks required of us to do. But our bigger concern is the uncertainty and the misinformation surrounding what's going on with the EPA regulations currently. And we are so concerned because right now they're starting big, but we know that will back up, and we understand the difficulty of permitting projects even at the state level. So every time something makes a project difficult, it makes it harder to get it financed. It's very difficult to finance them now. So we think more and more projects theoretically could be taken off the table. We have great concern about that. But our bigger concern is, and my concern as a citizen, is we are in an energy crisis. And we need to look at every single option out there to create more energy. And, again, I said I hung my hat on green energy, and we do a lot in that arena. But it doesn't work without new coal plants, without new nuclear plants, without creating additional energy, because we're still birthing babies, we're still graduating people from college, we're still building houses, and we want to be a manufacturing factor. So I sit here and think to myself, where is the outrage? Where is the outrage in that the Chinese are going to corner the energy market sooner or later? And we are not taking steps to create power now. And electricity is a key piece of it. And I want to see our nation look at ways to get every option on the table now. And that's our concern.
Yes, sir. What we call up here the all-above plan. Thank you for that answer, sir. Mr. Montgomery, question for you, sir. EPA Administrator Jackson often touts the creation of jobs by implementing new green control technologies. You've been in this field for about 40 years. Will the mandate to comply with greenhouse gas regulations produce a net job growth here in the United States as Administrator Jackson claimed? Yes or no?
No.
Want to elaborate on that?
Okay. It will certainly produce a shift. It will produce a shift of resources and industrial activity toward producing that pollution control equipment, but it will be taking those resources away from producing other things that people demand and contribute to our standard of living. It's not to say it might not be worth it if you judge that the benefits are large enough, but it is clearly going to be a cost. At best, it is going to involve moving people from one kind of job to another, not creating net new jobs. But on top of that, it's going to be a drag on productivity growth and investment, which is going to slow the rate of growth in the economy overall. And this has been something that has been seen by economists who have studied this going all the way back to work that Jorgensen and Wilcoxon did 20 years ago looking at the effect of the Clean Air Act amendments themselves. They found that, yes, there were some industries that were doing quite well producing that pollution control equipment, but the regulations were essentially a tax on capital investment. So it slowed down capital investment, it reduced the growth in worker productivity, because unlike the Luddites who do green job studies, we actually know from looking at history that the primary driver of productivity growth is increasing capital investment to make workers more productive. So all of those processes are slowed down by the higher costs that are imposed on the economy by the regulations, so that overall there's a depressing effect on our rate of growth, and internally there's some shuffling around of jobs from doing one thing to doing another.
So no new green technologies. Thank you for that answer. And my final question is going to be for Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, coal provides about 45% of our electric power. If the EPA's regulations were to go forward as planned, from what your testimony earlier today, that's about 75 gigawatts that are at risk?
Within that range, Congressman.
How would we replace the capacity of the coal industry?
That's a 64,000, not gigawatt question, but $64,000 question, Congressman. There is no way.
Any idea how many jobs it's going to cost us?
Well, if we're looking at a 70% reduction in the amount of coal, it's a 70% reduction in the amount of coal jobs with a multiplier of 10, so we're in the hundreds of thousands.
Thank you for that answer.
Mr. McKinley, West Virginia, recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a long day. We've broken twice. It sounded a little bit like Groundhog Day. We're back here again for the third time to try to get through all of this. After being towards the end of this questioning, it appears a lot of the questions have been asked. But I just want to kind of summarize where I am. So when I go home tonight, it appears that there seems to be a consensus that energy costs are going to rise if we have the greenhouse gas regulated under the Clean Air Act. If there is also consensus that will have a negative impact on industry, manufacturers. If they're negatively impacted, we're going to lose jobs. I got a letter. I mean, there were comments made that this was just a Republican thing. But here's a letter to the American Iron and Steel Institute. And it's a long letter. I'm not going to go through it. I'm going to ask that it be put in their record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And he goes on in his letter about just talks about the new regulations will create permitting obstacles in investing in new and renovated facilities, impose significant additional costs on domestic steel producers. The development of new environmental regulatory proposals across the country, it's having a deleterious effect on them. But he goes on to say the unprecedented speed of the EPA's effort to regulate the greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act threatens serious economic disruption. The greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act will create disincentives to invest, potential for new project construction delay, and increased litigation risk. He goes on to say with the Institute, it's not partisan. This is business. This is what it's all about here. We have 15 million Americans out of work today. and we're letting the EPA continue to cause this kind of challenge. And he goes on to say, it will raise operating costs, which will place our American steel manufacturers at a competitive disadvantage while allowing overseas competitors to continue to increase their emissions. The result would be limited environmental gain, but significant economic challenges, including further elimination of valuable American manufacturing jobs, especially for energy-intensive, trade-sensitive industries. Panel, I don't understand. I've only been here in Congress for not even 60 days. I don't understand why they don't get it. To me, it's axiomatic. This is fundamental economics 101. Why is it that they don't get it around here? Am I the one out of step? Mr. Sicchio?
Yeah. I have very diverse energy-intensive manufacturers, including some integrated steel companies plus recycled steel companies, and there's lots and lots of stories of truthful events where the steel companies have had to shut facilities down because of a 1/10 cent increase in the price of electricity. There are chemical companies that compete on a global scale with companies halfway around the world where they compete for a 1/10 cent per pound of a product. We are gripped. This is why I said in my testimony, our country and the manufacturing sector are gripped in competition. And many times our competition are governments, wrapped around companies, but they're governments, and they're subsidized.
But my question, why don't they get it? Why didn't, when we have so many people at work, we're threatening possibly one more time another round of employment losses at a time when we need our energy. Coal, nuclear, all, we're threatening ourselves. Yes, sir.
This is my personal opinion, but it is, this I think is a very good example of how Congress is not working well, and it's a very good example of how hard it is to take on a big issue. I would say that the first lesson in environmental economics is you have to compare the cost of a regulation to the benefits that you get. Well, when the costs of a regulation are large and the benefits are in the future, it's very hard to convince your constituents that that's a good thing to work for. So the analysis, instead of being an objective description of what's likely to happen, turns into a claim, this isn't a hard decision after all. There aren't any costs. They go away. And I'm afraid that that's how I see the debate being destroyed.
Thank you.
Mr. Scalise, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The theme of today's hearing is the greenhouse gas emissions and specifically the impact of these regulations on American jobs. And I think when we talk about American jobs, we had a hearing a few weeks ago, it's been referenced a few times, with EPA Administrator Jackson, and then we had a panel right after Administrator Jackson spoke, and it was a panel of business people, employers in this country, and it was like there was a parallel universe. You had the head of EPA talking about how the regulations that she's implementing are creating jobs, and then you literally had employer after employer after employer talking about those very EPA regulations and the uncertainty associated with it are costing American jobs. And so maybe what EPA Administrator Jackson's referring to are the jobs she's creating in China, in India, in other countries, because when you talk to employers, they're actually looking at real job losses. There was a company, a major steel manufacturer, that talked specifically about the burdensome permitting requirements and rising energy costs. Increasingly, industrial projects are no longer even being considered for development in the United States. Doesn't mean they're not being considered, they're just not being considered in the United States. They further went on to talk specifically about one of their projects. Due to the uncertainty created by these regulations, we made the difficult decision to delay the $2 billion investment, also delaying the creation of 2,000 construction jobs and 500 permanent ones. This was one company, we've heard this story over and over and over again, jobs that are leaving our country. And I want to ask Mr. Reichert, we've heard testimony in the past over this issue about carbon leakage and the fact that, let's say you're not building a steel mill here in the United States, you're going to build it in Brazil which is a viable option when people are looking at where they're going to build it. So if they build it in Brazil, you actually have maybe 4 times the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases emitted than if you would have built that plant today under current environmental regulations in the United States, not to mention the job loss. So first, do you recognize, one, there is real job loss going on out there in America, and number two, that because of these regulations by EPA, you're actually emitting more carbon because they're building these plants in other countries that actually have lower standards than us.
Well, Mr. Scalise, responding to you and Mr. McKinley, I think this issue of why, quote, they don't get it is, first, I think there are serious issues here with human health and the environment that flow from these greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, there are, in fact, serious economic issues. We are losing vast investment in this country
because of these regulations.
To countries where they have, in fact, decided to control the emissions of greenhouse gases and other pollutants. To the EU, increasingly to China, to places where they are taking these issues seriously.
Well, you're saying they're taking them seriously. They actually emit more greenhouse gases to do some of these manufacturing jobs and processes in those countries like China.
Fair question. So all the more reason why we've got to step up to it, and the rest of the world does as well. That's why we have international agreements. That's why we go and negotiate these.
So do you recognize that the uncertainty, though, what's going on in this country is costing American jobs? Will you at least acknowledge all of these, business after business?
Uncertainty, absolutely. Wall Street and Silicon Valley are moving their money away from this country to countries where, in fact, they are putting controls on greenhouse gas emissions.
Well,
like the EU.
Wall Street's done enough damage to our economy already. Let me ask Mr. Montgomery something, because I'm on limited time. I apologize. Mr. Montgomery, I'm not sure if you've read. There was a study about Spain's experiment with this scheme of cap and trade greenhouse gas emission regulation. Where they said they're going to create all these green jobs. What they found out later is for every green job they created, they lost 2.2 jobs. But then when they dug deeper into that, 90% of those jobs they created were part-time jobs. So in essence, for every green job they created, they lost 22 full-time jobs in their economy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that Spain study. If you want to comment on that.
Yes, there have been some criticisms of the study, but I think it's made some very good points. One of them is just how phony the accounting for green jobs can be, depending on what you're counting. The second one is that, yes, the cost of a mandate or a subsidy is borne by the country that does it. And Spain decided to put on huge subsidies, and that both decreased their own competitiveness across the board, and it attracted a lot of equipment to be built elsewhere.
Like we're seeing here, and I've only got a few seconds left. I want to ask Mr. Joyce something, because you talked about in your opening testimony, and I don't know if this was on behalf of NFIB or just your small business, but you referred to a recent study by the U.S. Small Business Administration that found that the total cost of regulation on the American economy is $1.75 trillion per year, and then further that the study reaffirmed that small businesses actually bear a much larger percentage, I think over 30% more of the cost than large businesses. So the uncertainty in these regulations are killing small businesses primarily, which is the real heart of our job creation in this country. I want to ask you to comment further.
Absolutely, because there's smaller network of sales to diversify the cost of implementing whatever the regulation is. So little businesses are wildly more impacted with these regulations than big ones who've got staffs that run it and they just blend it in there and it goes away. This hits a little businesses very, very significant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witnesses very much. We appreciate your testimony, and I know you didn't plan to spend this much time with us, but we hope maybe you'll come back someday, and this panel's dismissed.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
I want to thank you for having this hearing, and let me just point out that
we're not through.
I know. I just before they leave, though, I think it's great to point out that for 4 years there was an effort to green the Capitol and try to reduce our footprint here. But in 4 years, Congress is still burning coal to fire up the lamps over our head. And I think if that's any indication of the progress we've made, it's just good luck.
Well, of course, I like coal myself, Brian, but we'll call at this time on the second panel. We have Ms. Gina McCarthy, who is the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and we appreciate. Yeah. Okay. Ms. McCarthy, we appreciate your being with us today. I trust that you've enjoyed yourself as much as we have already. And I will tell you that we've adopted a new policy, and we're supposed to start hearings at 9 o'clock or 9:30, and we have no votes so that we can go straight through before anyone has to leave. So unfortunately, it didn't work out that way today, but we do appreciate your patience and your being with us very much. And with that, we'll go on and recognize you for your 5-minute opening statement, Ms. McCarthy.
Thank you very much. And again, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member Rush for inviting me here and the members of the committee to testify on this important subject. Let me get started. I know you've listened to a lot of testimony, so I'll be as crisp as I can, and then we can get to questions and answers. But EPA is just starting to update existing Clean Air Act programs in order to address greenhouse gas emissions. The Clean Air Act tools that we have been using are exactly the same Clean Air Act tools that have been responsible for achieving dramatically cleaner air and important public health benefits at reasonable cost. With its 40-year history of success, the Clean Air Act continues to be one of this country's greatest bipartisan achievements. Today, EPA is releasing a peer-reviewed study of the costs and benefits of the Clean Air Act since 1990. It demonstrates both the Clean Air Act's tremendous public health benefits as well as how cleaner air strengthens the economy. In the last year alone, programs implemented pursuant to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 are estimated to have reduced premature mortality risks equivalent to saving over 160,000 lives, to have spared Americans more than 100,000 hospital visits, prevented millions of cases of respiratory problems like asthma, to have enhanced productivity by preventing 13 million lost workdays, and to have kept kids healthy and in school, avoiding 3.2 million lost school days due to respiratory illnesses and other diseases that are either caused or exacerbated by pollution. EPA can't monetize all the benefits from recent Clean Air Act regulations, but to the extent that we can, this study tells us that the Clean Air Act provides $2 trillion in benefits in 2020 alone. That's over $30 in benefits for every single dollar that we spend. This is a tremendous value for the American people. Most of the rules that gave us these huge gains in public health were adopted amidst claims similar to what we're hearing today, claims that they would be bad for the economy and bad for employment. Some claim that the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 themselves would cost at least 200,000 or up to even 2 million jobs. In contrast to all of those dire predictions, history has shown again and again that we can clean up pollution, we can create jobs, and we can grow our economy all at the same time. Since 1970, air pollution has actually declined 63%, while at the same time, the economy has grown 204%. Discussions of job impacts often overlook the jobs that come from building and installing pollution control equipment. The Institute for Clean Air Companies estimated that over the past 7 years, the implementation of just one rule, the Clean Air Act interstate rule, resulted in 200,000 jobs in the air pollution control industry. In a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, 8 major utilities that will be affected by our greenhouse gas regulations said that contrary to claims that EPA's agenda will have negative economic consequences, our company's experience complying with air quality regulations demonstrates that they can yield important economic benefits, including job creation, while maintaining reliability. The Clean Air Act has also helped spark world-class innovations in the United States. For example, EPA vehicle emission standards led to the development and application of a huge range of technologies like catalytic converters, onboard computers, fuel injection systems, even unleaded gasoline. These innovations are now found throughout the global automotive market. And the vehicle emission control industry now employs approximately 65,000 Americans, with domestic annual sales of $26 billion. The environmental technology and services industry employed 1.7 million workers in 2008. and that taps into the global market that's worth over $700 billion. And that is a market the size of the aerospace or the pharmaceutical industry. Globally, America can compete and lead in the environmental and clean energy sectors, but only if we take steps at home to continue to innovate. As we drive towards cleaner air and clean energy, we need to challenge innovation and challenge technology excellence. We're now starting to achieve address greenhouse gases by applying Clean Air Act regulatory tools that have been used successfully now for 4 decades. EPA is compelled to do so by the Clean Air Act, the Supreme Court's decision, as well as sound science. These greenhouse gas tools that we're going to use require the agency always to take cost into consideration, and they will allow the agency to move forward using common sense, reasonable, measured requirements. The first greenhouse gas rule EPA issued is already demonstrating how practical regulations can make sense for the economy. Last April, EPA and the Department of Transportation completed harmonized national standards to reduce greenhouse gas pollution from new cars and trucks. The vehicles sold in model years 2012 to 2016 will save 1.85 billion barrels of oil while reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 962 million tons. The rules were supported by both the auto workers as well as the auto manufacturers, who recognize that these standards help them stay competitive in a global marketplace where fuel efficiency increasingly matters. And they'll also save consumers money. A 2016 model year vehicle will save you $3,000 over the life of that vehicle. The regulatory focus on improved efficiency isn't unique just to motor vehicles. EPA is also focusing on energy efficiency as the preferred method of meeting greenhouse gas permit requirements for power plants and large industrial facilities. And let's all be clear. These new greenhouse gas permit requirements apply only when a new facility is being built, or when a company is making major modifications at an existing facility. The universe for these greenhouse gas permits are large greenhouse gas emitters, but the universe is very small and it's manageable to achieve. Leadership in new technologies combined with healthier workers and fewer air-related health effects help lay the foundation for robust long-term economic growth and the employment that comes along with it. We shouldn't pass up the opportunity to use the Clean Air Act to promote efficiency, energy security, to protect public health because of the same inaccurate claims about job losses that have been leveled against major actions under the Clean Air Act for 4 decades now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McCarthy. I was reading an article recently of Duke University, the Nicholas Institute of Environmental Policy Solutions, and in there they quoted you had said that if you apply the 250 tons per year limit for greenhouse gases, that it would require 6 million sources to obtain Title V permits and lead to 82,000 permitting actions under PSD, resulting in an estimated combined cost of $22.5 billion to the permitting authorities alone. Now, I know you have the tailoring rule, but without referring to the administrative necessity doctrine or the absurd results doctrine, doesn't your tailoring act explicitly violate the terms of the Clean Air Act as to the limits?
Mr. Chairman, I would tell you that your quote is correct. That is the reason why the administration put together the tailoring rule, and we believe that it is not only a legally sound approach to making sure that...
But without reference to the administrative necessity or absurd result, it does violate the precise wording of the Clean Air Act.
I am trying to explain to you that we believe that that is the best interpretation of Congress's intent when it is
But is that your,
regulating a new pollutant
but,
like
but you do recognize it
carbon.
does violate the explicit terms of the Clean Air Act?
I do not believe that it violates the Clean Air Act. I believe it is a.
Well, your limits are above the 100 to 250 tons per year.
They
correct?
certainly are, and we've approached it, I think, in a very measured way to make sure that we don't.
Now, let me ask you, did your agency conduct a comprehensive economic or job analysis of the impact of the greenhouse gas regulations?
I'm sorry, could you say it again, Mr. Chairman?
Did your agency conduct an analysis of the impact of the greenhouse gas rules on jobs in the economy?
Yeah, the greenhouse gas rules, certainly we did with the light-duty vehicle rule. We've talked about that a little bit.
But on stationary sources?
On stationary sources, the way in which the Clean Air Act works is that we're not setting a standard for permitting. Those permitting decisions are rightly done.
So is your answer no?
My answer is that states do that in the course of doing the best available control technology permitting process.
But EPA, you do not do it then?
Well, we do not know businesses' intent in terms
Do
of.
you all do any sort of analysis on how you're going to replace lost electricity generating capacity from any of the regulations?
I do not anticipate the greenhouse gases will result, the greenhouse gas regulations will result in any lost electricity generation.
So you don't think the regulations will cause the loss of any capacity?
In terms of electric generating, no, I do not.
Okay. That bill wasn't my time, but I'm going to, at this point, recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCarthy, I really want to apologize, first of all, that you had to wait this long, and most of the members have gone, and we suspended the activities on the House floor, and the media, for the most part, is left to hear your testimony, so I apologize for that. But that said, we have to do what we have to do here. Let me just ask you, well, today's hearing focuses on the jobs impact of greenhouse gas regulations under the Clean Air Act. And there's no question that this Congress must focus on job creation. Unemployment rates are unacceptably high, and joblessness is taking a terrible toll on our nation. And in your professional opinion, what would be some of the consequences, particularly economic, but also environmentally and in the area of public health, if Congress did enact such a bill as the Upton-Inhofe bill, where EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gases would be repealed without any type of legislative alternative that's been presented to us? Can you?
Yes, I can speak to that, and I appreciate the question. We are very concerned with the bill in terms of what it might do for our ability to make sure that businesses that want to actually be constructed, or businesses that want to modify, being able to make sure that those Clean Air Act permits are available to them. So we are very concerned that we protect the interests of the Clean Air Act, that we protect our ability to issue permits when permits should be required and are deserved, and that we move forward with the Clean Air Act as it was intended. Carbon pollution is a pollutant. It's a pollutant under the Act. It is a danger to public health and welfare. We believe we can take measured approaches to controlling that pollutant and to making sure that as new facilities are constructed and major modifications are done, that we minimize the kind of greenhouse gas emissions that are additionally emitted into the atmosphere.
The idea that the Clean Air Act requirements to control carbon pollution have anything to do with unemployment problem, to me, is a sheer fantasy. We're struggling with a worldwide global recession. We all know that regulations don't cause that recession. On the contrary, the absence of adequate regulations cause the financial meltdown. You testified that EPA recently prepared a white paper highlighting the connection between the Clean Air Act and jobs and economic growth in the United States. Are the findings highlighted in that paper based on peer-reviewed literature?
Yes, they are.
And what do these peer-reviewed peer-reviewed studies find regarding the actual effect of Clean Air Act regulation on jobs and the economy?
Well, what I've found, and it's rather remarkable, is that when the economists looked at some of the most heavily regulated industries, they did not find evidence that regulation leads to larger job losses. For example, there was an article by Morgenstern that looked at 4 of the most heavily regulated industries, and it found that increased environmental spending does not cause a significant change in employment in those regulated industries. On average, there was a gain of 1.5 jobs for every $1 million in additional environmental spending. Now, that doesn't mean that the Clean Air Act is a jobs act. It is clearly a public health act. But the most remarkable thing is that for every dollar that you spend in order to clean up the air under the Clean Air Act, you get $30 in health benefits. So it's a significantly effective public health measure. But the great thing is that it does have ancillary benefits of job growth, and there is no evidence that that is a factor in significant job losses in the economy. In fact, just the opposite.
Can you give us some examples of the types of jobs created when we clean up the environment?
Sure. Someone, when they have to design and build and run and maintain pollution control equipment, those someone's are jobs. For example, installing a scrubber on a power plant can create up to 1,000 construction jobs and 100 permanent jobs. In addition, scrubbers require steel. That creates jobs as well. There was a study by the U.S. Boilermakers that looked at jobs between 1999 and 2001, and it found that their jobs grew by 35%. That's 6,700 jobs. So what we find now is there is a thriving environmental protection industry. In 2008, that was $300 billion in revenues were generated from that industry sector. 1.7 million jobs, American jobs, in that sector. And they were exporting $44 billion worth of equipment and technology. We think that's rather a good success story.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Welcome, Assistant Administrator. Just for the record, are you a presidential appointee or a civil service?
I am a presidential appointee.
Okay. And how long have you held the position?
Since June of 2009.
Okay. And what was your prior position within the administration, if any?
It was not. I did not work for the administration. I worked for the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. I was the commissioner of that agency.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Your opening in your statement, in your testimony, prepared testimony, talks about all the things that are the benefit of the Clean Air Act. May surprise you, but I was a supporter and voted for the Clean Air Act back in 1990, and it was bipartisan. I would say that the attempt to tie greenhouse gas regulation to the Clean Air Act is a stretch, because in my opinion, I don't believe that CO2 is a pollutant under the definition of the Clean Air Act, nor do I believe that it is a health hazard. Do you have any statistics that indicate CO2 has caused any kind of poisoning that requires emergency room assistance or anything like that?
CO2 is not a toxic pollutant.
So in terms of when you're talking in your testimony about the benefits of the Clean Air Act, you talk about premature mortality, savings, and things like that. Those types of criteria would not apply to CO2.
No, Mr. Button, that's where I would differ. I would tell you that CO2 is very much a pollutant that impacts public health and welfare. I would tell you that CO2 actually does contribute to ozone pollution, which is a significant health hazard. And I would tell you that the Supreme Court that really interprets Congress's intent for the rest of us told us that we had to consider greenhouse gas as a pollutant.
Well,
under
actually, the
law.
Supreme Court said that EPA had to make a decision whether it should be
Consider it.
regulated.
That's correct. Consider it.
Okay, what, do you know what the level of CO2 right now, generally speaking, is in the atmosphere?
Actually, I don't have that figure in the
If I were to say it's around 380
That-
parts per billion, would you
Probably
accept
right.
that in the ballpark?
That's probably right, yeah.
Okay, do you know what a greenhouse, houses that grow plants and food within a greenhouse, do you know what the average CO2 parts per million is in a greenhouse?
I'm sure you will tell me.
You don't have any idea?
No.
So if I say it's around 1,000, which is what it is, you won't dispute that? Do you know what you create in CO2 when you answer my questions? Do you know what the amount of CO2 coming out when you answer a question is? We have about 380 parts per million in the atmosphere. Commercial greenhouse gases exist at about 1,000 parts per million. And when you answer a question or when I ask you a question, I expel CO2 at the rate of about 40,000 parts per billion. So how in the world can that be a pollutant? If it is, my good friend Bobby Rush would be gasping for breath right now and turning red in the face, and my good friend Mr. Waxman. I mean, yeah. I mean, the fact is, under any definition, greenhouse gases, of which CO2 is one, are necessary for life.
No one is disputing that.
So, I mean, I know you're here to be the good soldier, and I know there's a massive world debate about the greenhouse gases, but when we try to apply the Clean Air Act, which I voted for, in which a majority of the Republicans on this committee, in fact, I think all but one or two voted for, that were on the committee, it just doesn't work. It just, the definitional terms are different. So we have a difference of opinion on our side in terms of whether this is a necessary thing. Why do you need the tailoring rule to implement greenhouse gas regulations?
Greenhouse gases is, as you know, a new pollutant under the Clean Air Act. We took a look to ensure that the application of the Clean Air Act to the greenhouse gas pollutant was done in a reasoned, common sense way. We wanted to make sure that we phased in the greenhouse gas regulations in a way that made sense, in a way that was manageable, in a way that would meet the intent of Congress. When we looked at that, we decided, and the administrator clearly made a determination, that there were many small sources that could potentially be regulated by greenhouse gases. She made a determination that that didn't make sense under the law. And so we issued the tailoring rules so that we got at the vast majority of greenhouse gases by regulating a minimum of the largest sources first.
My time has expired. Before I recognize the next witness, the next questioner, would you submit for the record the EPA's official position on the control technology, if any, that's best able right now to actually regulate greenhouse gases, if there is such a technology?
There are many technologies for
Would you
regulating
submit
greenhouse gases.
for the record those technologies and their cost effectiveness if you have that information?
I could certainly provide you a range of technology choices that we have put out in white papers to help guide state decisions that are efficient technologies that help advance reductions in greenhouse gases.
Thank you. The chair inquires of the minority. Do we? Mr. Markey was the one here closest, but Mr. Waxman is the ranking member. Who should? Okay. The chair would recognize Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Ms. McCarthy, we've heard a lot today about the greenhouse gas regulations that went into effect in January. We've heard from witnesses today that these regulations will be, quote, near impossible to meet. Yet this committee has also received testimony from industry that EPA's approach has been, quote, reasonable and does not impose undue hardship. I'd like to ask you some questions to help me understand exactly what is required under these new regulations for stationary sources. First, can you confirm that only new sources or existing sources that expand and significantly increased emissions are currently subject to any requirements?
That's correct.
Thank you. So, for example, if I own a power plant that is already up and running and I don't make any changes, I don't have to do anything differently, do I?
No.
But new facilities will have to go through a technology review process to determine best available control technology, or BACT, to limit carbon pollution at the facility. In most of the country, this review is carried out by state or local permitting agencies, not by EPA itself. Are you aware that the National Association of Clean Air Agencies has surveyed its members, and most states reported that they only expect to do 0, 1, or 2 permits this year?
Yes.
Members of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies recently briefed House staff on some of the permit reviews they've already begun. In the examples they shared, they concluded that energy efficiency would likely be all that was needed. I'd like to use an example that New York State shared in order to ask if this is consistent with EPA's guidance. In New York, a Lafarge cement plant volunteered to go through the process. The state began by identifying all available technologies that might limit carbon pollution. This initial list included carbon capture and sequestration, but did not include switching to a different type of fuel. Is this consistent with EPA's guidance?
Entirely, yes.
The state then quickly eliminated CCS as technically infeasible. The state indicated that because no geologic formation existed close to the cement plant, CCS would not be feasible. Is this consistent with the guidance you've issued?
Yes.
The state then ranked the various options for limiting emissions and eliminated options that were too expensive. Finally, the state selected the technologies that it thought would be required. The state determined that the cement plant could reduce its carbon pollution by 12% by installing several types of energy efficiency equipment, including high-efficiency motors, fans, and burners. These efficiency features would constitute BACT. Is this the type of determination appropriate under EPA's guidance?
Yes.
It sounds to me like this was a logical, reasonable process, and I understand that Lafarge Cement expects that these efficiency improvements will reduce their operating costs and save them money. Is it fair to assume that many other facilities may actually save money too?
Yes.
I hope the other states will follow this common sense example and find ways to reduce pollution and improve efficiency. I have some time remaining if any of my colleagues wish me to yield to them. Otherwise, I'll yield back my time. Mr. Green?
Thank my friend. Ms. McCarthy, yesterday my good friend in the Senate who served on this committee, Sherrod Brown from Ohio, called on President Obama to direct the EPA to implement a plan to provide financial and technical transition assistance protecting U.S. manufacturing as we move forward with the greenhouse gas regulations. Last Congress, when this chamber considered cap and trade, I was equally concerned about the issue and working hard. Can you comment on what the administration is doing to address these concerns and moving forward with these regulations?
Yes, I would be happy to. We have taken great pains as we begin to regulate greenhouse gases to work with the states and work with the permitting entities. We have provided a wealth of technical assistance. We've produced guidance documents that help walk them through this process. We have put white papers out that explain the cost-effective technologies available in all of the major industry sectors that could be potentially regulated. We're also having listening sessions before we move forward with additional regulation to make sure that we understand the needs of the company and that we can effectively reduce greenhouse gases in ways that are cost-effective. Every rule that we have available to us under the Clean Air Act that's suitable for greenhouse gas regulations requires us to look at cost. So we will go out of our way to make sure that we're using not just a common sense approach, but one that reduces cost to the fullest extent we can and still achieve the required reductions under the Clean Air Act.
I know that time's expired, and I have a question I'd like to submit about how good natural gas is to replace the problem we have with carbon, Mr. Chairman.
Well, certainly without objection, I'll support that.
Okay. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator McCarthy, thank you for being here. In Phoenix, in fact, just about a month ago, at the 14th Annual Energy, Utility, and Environmental Conference in Phoenix, it says that you were involved or advocating not just a tweaking of current energy use, but a fundamental overhaul of the nation's production and use of energy. EPA is ready, willing, and able to drive this overhaul. You emphasized, and a quote here, "We must transform the power sector in a way that meets the needs of the 21st century," who repeatedly use the word transform to describe EPA's goal for the nation's energy use. So I guess a question that would come up, where in the statute does EPA get the authority to transform the power sector?
That was if I may, just to give you the background for the conference, that was a conference of technology developers. What we were referring to was the range of Clean Air Act actions that are impacting the utility sector. And we were talking about the fleet that is out there in the utility sector, in the extreme inefficiency of many of the units that are out there, in the Clean Air Act implications of having those facilities install current technology that's available currently and has been available for 30 years, that can actually clean them up and move towards a cleaner fleet.
But fundamentally, it is the job of the legislative branch to come to those conclusions in conjunction with the development of a national energy policy. So transformation of the power sector of America really should be a legislative initiative, not an administrative initiative or an executive branch initiative.
I'm not sure if that was a direct quote, but what I was there to talk about was our opportunity to achieve significant public health protection for American families by looking at how we could provide certainty in the regulated community so investments would flow to utilities, those that are inefficient would be able to upgrade, those that are inefficient would know what their regulatory obligation was, and we could start an investment.
Before the time expires.
Yep.
In a transformed power sector, how much coal would we be able to use in a transformed power sector? Do you have a figure in mind for that? And along the same lines, Gene Green just asked a question about natural gas. How much coal, how much natural gas, how much nuclear?
No, EPA is rightly not in the business of choosing fuels. We are in the business of regulating pollutants. And what we have done with the greenhouse gas rules is we've made sure that if you're building a coal facility, you should be as clean as a coal facility can get. We have not suggested that a different fuel needs to be used. Again, we're trying to provide certainty for businesses as they need to be permitted, that are coming in new and making major modifications.
Well, speaking in terms of certainty, you were here a year ago, or just right after the Deepwater Horizon started causing problems, and the subject that day was a briefing. It wasn't a hearing, so there's no record of it, unfortunately. But the subject of it was on the Environmental Protection Agency going to a new standard of 15% ethanol in motor fuels and gasoline.
Yes.
And I don't know if you recall or not, but I asked you and Department of Energy, who was there with you that day, about where were the studies that we could look at that showed that this indeed was a reasonable thing to do, and that in fact people who had snow blowers and two-cycle engines would not have damage to their equipment by a 15% ethanol mixture. Do you recall that briefing that we had?
I do.
And you know, I never got any information from either EPA or the Department of Energy about the testing that was done, as supposedly done. In fact, it almost seemed to be finger-pointing, one agency pointing at the other, saying, well, the other guy is responsible for this. But as we come up with this mandate that was described by Congress in December 2007, the amount of ethanol that has to be offloaded into the nation's fuel supply is, I believe, what was driving the, no pun intended, what was driving the concern to bump the amount up to 15%. Is that correct?
Not on the part of EPA. EPA was responding to waiver requests.
Well, where are we
The
with
gentleman's
that?
time just expired.
Are you, do we have those studies available?
We do, and I apologize if we weren't as responsive as we should be. We will send you the waiver decisions that were made that incorporate all of the scientific information in them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Gasoline prices went up almost 20 cents in the last week, the biggest weekly jump in prices since Hurricane Katrina. In 1975, we imported 6 million barrels of oil per day. Today, that number is nearly 12 million barrels per day. Prices have risen by a factor of 13 since 1975. Foreign oil purchases account for roughly 1/2 of the United States trade deficit, just to import that oil largely from OPEC. Oil money supports Iran's nuclear program, roadside bombs in Iraq, rockets for Hezbollah and Hamas, and hate-filled Wahhabi teachings in Saudi Arabia. Now, the Republicans are busy raising the specter of the Clean Air Act's devastating economic impacts, despite reports showing that the Clean Air Act has historically led to increases in jobs and will provide $2 trillion in benefits in 2020. But what the Republicans are planning in order to address this fabricated threat is likely to create a real danger for the United States. This committee may soon take up a bill that would tie EPA's hands and prevent it from taking any steps to reduce dangerous global warming pollution under the Clean Air Act. What the legislation would also do is prevent EPA from taking any steps to reduce our dangerous dependence on foreign oil. Ms. McCarthy, the legislation this committee may soon act on could open up the existing car and light truck oil saving standards to legal challenge and will prevent further standards from being set. It will prevent further implementation of the renewable fuels standard, and it will prevent EPA from doing anything to reduce oil use from planes, trains, boats, and other industrial sources. In fact, this bill could result in an increase in our oil dependence of more than 5 million barrels of oil a day by the year 2030, more than we currently import from OPEC. Do you agree that this legislation could dangerously increase our dependence on foreign oil by preventing EPA from being able to take any steps to reduce demand?
I would agree.
2 weeks ago, the House passed a continuing resolution for spending for the rest of 2011. And that legislation was containing a rider that would block the EPA from using any funds to move forward in any way on curbing global warming pollution. For the landmark car and light truck efficiency standards to be fully implemented, EPA still has to sign off on California's plan to allow companies that are complying with the national standard to be deemed compliant with California standards. If EPA is not allowed to sign off on California's compliance plan, could that put the entire fuel economy agreement that is supported by all stakeholders in jeopardy?
It could.
The President recently issued an executive order that requires federal agencies to propose regulations only after seeking the views of those who might be impacted by them. Can you give me an example of how EPA is complying with this directive in its efforts to regulate global warming pollution?
Very quickly, we have the administrator has charged us, and we have gone out and done listening sessions even before we begin the regulatory process to look at new source performance standards for greenhouse gases.
The President's executive order also requires agencies to take the special needs of small businesses into account while developing regulations. Can you give me an example of how EPA has complied with this directive as it contemplates regulations to reduce global warming pollution?
The greenhouse gas tailoring rule eliminated the need to permit 6 million small facilities.
The threat to our economy is the threat that is coming from a dramatic spike in oil. That usually signals the return of a recession. That is where we lose the jobs. If we tie the hands of the EPA from taking the kind of bold action which they should take in order to reduce our dependence upon imported oil in the long run, we are going to repeat this cycle of job destruction that has been our relationship with imported oil going all the way back to 1973. How many times do we have to relearn this lesson? 1973, 1979, 80, 1991, 92, on and on, right up to the $4 a gallon gasoline in 2008 that foreshadowed this economic catastrophe. It is imperative that we defeat this Republican effort to tie the hands of the EPA from ensuring that the renewable fuel standard, that the fuel economy standards are in place that increase, using technology, our ability to tell OPEC we don't need their oil any more than we need their sand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. It shows Mr. Olson is next. Is that y'all's understanding? Okay. We'll go to Mr. Olson, and then Mr. Bilbray, and then Mr. McKinley. What's your time frame, Madam Administrator? Are you okay for another 15 minutes? Or so?
I am here for you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
I thank the chair. And Administrator McCarthy, as you know, jobs are the biggest concerns of the American people right now. We've had 10% unemployment for about 2 years. And EPA Administrator Jackson touts the job creation of the new green control technologies. When I asked one of our previous witnesses if she was right or wrong about creating these great jobs, he said, wrong, wrong. Are you aware of any analysis done by EPA to determine the economic impact, specifically with regard to jobs, of the EPA's greenhouse gas regulations?
No.
Don't you think EPA should look at jobs and they're proposing some greenhouse gas regulations?
Let me just expand on that. The greenhouse gas tools that we're using, the tools we're using to regulate greenhouse gases, are the same tools that we have used in the Clean Air program for 40 years. And what we have found is that those tools actually provide cost-effective public health measures that actually grow the economy and in many ways provide one of the most significant public health benefits that are available to us. So for every dollar we spend on clean air, we get $40 in public health benefits. And so we believe that our job is to deliver public health to the people in this country, but we're not insensitive to the cost impacts and the job impacts. And what I would say is that the other point I would really like to make is that the Clean Air Act, because of the public health benefits it creates in terms of making sure that people can get to work, means that people can be productive and keep their jobs. What it means in terms of kids staying healthy, staying in school, is incredibly important if you're a single parent or if your parents would both need to work. We're providing opportunities for clean air. We're providing opportunities to keep people healthy. That certainly keeps people productive.
I ask you to submit further answer for the record, please, ma'am. Yes. Got a limited time here. Would you be opposed to an inclusion of a detailed job statement and impact statement anytime EPA proposes new regulations? Would you be opposed to that?
We already do a detailed regulatory impact assessment with the Office of Management and Budget for our rules.
Something that we could include the private sector in to get their opinion as well?
We actually do peer review of all our methodologies. That includes going to the private sector using economists and scientists. So everything we do is peer reviewed in terms of the methodology. The data is transparent, and we believe we do a very good job.
Well, thank you. Then I'll put you down as a big yes for having a more determinative jobs impact statement from EPA when they propose to change regulations. And coming down the home stretch here, I want to talk about a problem my home state is having with the EPA regarding the permitting process that has been done by the Texas Council on Environmental Quality for the last 15 years. Basically, EPA is taking over the regulation of the power generation in refineries in our state. Again, it's been going on for the last 15 years. Our state had a SIP approved 15 years ago, 3 administrations, 2 Democrat, 1 Republican, that Texas operated under, again, approved by the EPA. Essentially, it achieves its clean air goals by giving Texas the flexibility to establish caps for all emitting facilities at a plant instead of each individual piece of equipment. EPA is hurting Texas economy and jobs right now by taking over this permitting process. Just as an example of what's happened since EPA has done that, in late December, a major refiner has spent $4 million to quote-unquote deflex. The problem I have with all of this is the flexible permitting process has worked. Since 1999, flexible permitting has achieved a 22% decrease in ozone, a 53% decrease in nitrous oxide, compared to the national average of 15% for ozone and 27% for nitrous oxide. So Texas, 22% in ozone, the nation 15%, Texas 53% in ozone, the nation 29%. We're doing all this while adding 3.5 million people and creating half the private sector jobs in America since our country went into recession in 2009.
The gentleman's time expires. He needs to.
I'll wrap up real quickly. The point of the Clean Air Act is clean air. Texas has done better than most. Why is EPA taking this over?
I would just have to object to this, to the phrase that we're taking anything over, Mr. Olson. I believe we're doing the best job that we can to work with TCEQ to make sure that the permits they issue are federally enforceable, that provide a sound platform for your businesses to operate with confidence. We do not believe that the flexible air permits are enforceable under federal law. We believe they put those businesses at risk. We believe they're not transparent enough for the communities that live around those facilities to know that they're on a level playing field with the way that every other state issues its permit and does business.
Then why did it take 18 years to come to that conclusion?
I believe that it was under the Bush administration that first raised the issue that these flexible air permits need to be fixed.
But you don't dispute that for 18 years EPA said it was, well, they didn't positively say it was okay. They didn't choose to say it was not okay, and they only decided it was not okay this last year.
Well, we've made a concerted effort to try to work with the state and work with the industries to switch what we believe is not an appropriate and federally enforceable.
Is there any other state that's had the success in actually reducing the criteria pollutants like Texas has?
We have had many areas that have had great success, and I'm not disputing that Texas hasn't had reductions in air pollution. What I will say is they don't use a process that even EPA can figure out what is going on in those facilities and ensure that they're complying with federal requirements.
That's the subject of another hearing. The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Brush.
Thank you. Mrs. McCarthy, the CAFE standard.
Yes.
Is the CAFE standard set with 100% fossil fuel gasoline, 10% or 15% ethanol? What's the fuel mixture that is used to set the CAFE standard?
The CAFE standard isn't based on the fuel mixture, it's based on fuel efficiency.
Fuel
efficiency. It's based on the efficiency of the vehicle.
So when I was the guy who had the emissions put on the sticker next to the mileage, but when the consumer gets the mileage reading,
it's based on zero. It's based on fuel without any ethanol, if that's your question.
Okay.
That is our certification.
Okay,
fuel.
so you are using 100% fossil fuel as your standard for CAFE.
That's correct.
And is there a reason why you don't use ethanol in the mixture?
It just hasn't been updated of late to recognize the fact that there is ethanol in most of the fuel.
And ethanol has an impact on fuel mileage, right?
It does.
What's your number? 66%, 70% of of gasoline?
I don't have that on the top of my head. It depends on certainly the amount of ethanol in the mix.
Well, no, I'm talking about ethanol as compared to gasoline. The carbon chain is 66%, 70%.
I don't know the answer.
Okay, I think that is a critical component I'd like to talk to you about, because as somebody that's worked in the local level on when we talk about if we're going to address that issue, first of all, the consumer is not allowed in the United States, right, to use 100% gasoline in the fuel system, because the retailer is not allowed to sell it to the consumer without 10%.
No, that is incorrect.
Okay, I can go buy real straight gasoline.
It depends on where you live and what time of the year.
Okay, that's astonishing. I'm just telling you because we get into it. California fought for years to try to oppose this, and you remember that battle. A lot of your state agencies supported us on this. Mike, then let me get back to the And oh, by the way, in California, we're paying $6 a comparable gallon for ethanol. Now, when we talk about something that has only the energy of 70%, let's give them 70% of gasoline, wouldn't you agree that our content mandate should reflect real usable energy and not just volume? You following what I'm saying? In other words, there are certain green fuels that can produce 100% equity with gasoline. You have right now on the market a green fuel that only provides 66 to 70% of the energy of traditional fossil fuel. Don't you think that it would be much more real-world standard if we allowed the BTUs to be the content requirement rather than by volume?
Actually, I would have to say that what we regulate are air emissions. We don't force particular mixtures of fuels. We force those fuels to meet certain.
Ma'am, wait a second. I got to call you down on that, because we've got study on study that the CARB fuel was cheaper and cleaner than the oxygenated fuel with ethanol. We have standards after standard in California. EPA, before you showed up, held us off for years. We had a cleaner, cheaper fuel. We're mandated in California to put ethanol into our fuel. All I'm asking you is this. Seeing that mandate requires that only 70% of the energy, or comparable 7%, not 10%, but 7% of the energy in that tank is renewable, don't you think that it would be more reasonable to reflect that we allow the standard to be either 10% by volume or 7% by energy? Because it's the energy. Wouldn't you agree that energy is what matters, not the volume?
I understand exactly what you're saying, and all I would suggest is I am unprepared for this conversation. I am here to talk about greenhouse gases. If you'd like to carry on this conversation, I'm certainly happy to do that, and we'll bring our technical experts.
My point is the fact that the standard that is touted so much by my colleague from Massachusetts has major problems that need to be corrected and ought to be corrected through legislation if the EPA can't address it. That fact that the consumer is actually losing out 30% of the energy for ethanol that you do not get gasoline. And this is what my point on this from the emissions point of view. Emission standards are set per gallon, not per BTU.
I understand.
So now you've got this stuff hiding as equal to gasoline when it doesn't give you the energy of gasoline, but they're trying to compare apples and oranges. And this is a major problem we need to address.
The gentleman's time is just about to expire. We appreciate the gentleman's questions on ethanol and fuel standards. The gentlelady is right. This is a greenhouse gas hearing on CO2, but those were very good.
Well, Mr. Chair, let me just say, but the issue here, though, is that by mandating the fuel as part of it, the emissions issue is hidden. Because when you talk the fact that the efficiency of the fuel is so deficient, you're now hiding this huge pollutant that's being brought into it in volume rather than talking about the true emissions per mile driven. And what matters...
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. We don't want to let you pull an Ed Markey on us here. So, we also appreciate the gentlelady's refreshing candor in answering the questions. The distinguished gentleman from West Virginia I think is going to be the last questions unless Mr. Rush has some questions.
I read through your remarks, your opening statement several times and highlighted some features too. I think what I'm gathering from your remarks that the regulation of the greenhouse gases through the Clean Air Act is going to create jobs. It's going to offset the jobs that it's going to cost. And I've gone through it. It talks about how by the year 2020. We're going to have $2 trillion in benefits, a $30 benefit for every dollar spent. That the economy is billions of dollars larger today because of the Clean Air Act. In the past 7 years, 200,000 jobs have been created in the air pollution industry, air pollution control industry. I could go on. It was very interesting. But I come from West Virginia, and with all due respect, I don't want to see us take a risk that you're posing with that analysis and the empirical fantasy. What I believe, what I deal with, I'm an engineer, what I deal with is in reality. And the reality, the jobs you describe, they're not going to be in West Virginia. When you crush our economy with over 50% of the revenue for the state of West Virginia comes from coal. We heard testimony earlier from some of your other compatriots that when you take away that, we're either going to have, in West Virginia, the state government is going to have to either cut services or raise taxes. And that's going to discourage a lot of investment in West Virginia. There's a steel company in Weirton and one in Wheeling that combined used to have over 30,000 employees. But because of the over-regulations and what's happened overseas, they're down to only 2,000 employees. They're just a shadow of what they were. And when you talk to them, it's all because of government and the regulations and the lack of control of what's coming in from overseas. So when I go back on the weekends, I meet with the steel workers. I meet with the coal miners. They're scared to death of what Washington is doing and what the EPA is doing. They don't know how they're going to have a job tomorrow. They don't know how they're going to have a roof over their heads for their children and what their future is. They're scared to death of what the EPA, they're more over-regulation with it. A good remark, they said, why can't our families have the same enjoyment that the EPA families are having with what they're doing to us? So these realities that I refer to, they're coming from the people in my district. They're scared. They're worried about the government, the overregulated. When I went through your report, it's all based. So much of it's based on your own funded studies rather than independent scientific. It's your reports that you're quoting, and then you refer to the a B-rated environmental journal that's used. Not even one of the top ones in the country that worldwide, globally, is respected. You're using a B-rated journal to use as to shore up your argument of why you should do these kinds of things. I'm just asking, Madam, with a straight face, how can you honestly say that the enforcement of the greenhouse gases are going to create jobs and the people in West Virginia are going to be okay?
Well, you've hit many different issues.
Could you speak up a little louder, please?
I'm sorry. You've addressed a number of issues, and let me try to get at these. I've been in the environmental business, so to speak, as a regulator for 30 years. I came from a working class family as well. I do not believe that in this day and age we need to make a choice between clean jobs, good jobs, and breathing clean air. I think we have proven in 40 years.
Just show me how you're going to create the job. Tell me what's going to happen.
In 40 years of history of the Clean Air Act.
I don't want the fantasy. I want to know how specifically are we going to replace those jobs, because their jobs are being lost.
I do not believe that the approach we are taking on greenhouse gases, because it is done in a common sense, phased, measured way, that is doing anything other than trying to identify the most cost-effective ways for new businesses to get permits and to do their business.
Did you not hear the testimony from the people that were just here 2 or 3 hours prior to you to talk about the effect?
I did.
Gentleman's time is expired, but we'll let the administrator answer the question.
Let me make just a couple of points, and one is that the permit requirements only are dealing with the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. They are only looking at the best technology to make them efficient when new ones are coming online or when they're making major modifications. That is what we're doing. And the data that I have in my testimony is all based on peer-reviewed science, is not just EPA studies. It's all transparent. What I listen to are many people with ideas and concerns. I appreciate those. But there were some documents that you are listening to that I don't think are transparent, that I don't think have been peer-reviewed. And I think the one thing that I'm trying to do is to present you with information so that you can make the appropriate decisions. And I do believe that there's a wealth of scientific data that says we need to take action to reduce greenhouse gases, that is one of our most significant public health challenges, and that the Clean Air Act for 40 years has been a premier opportunity to actually reduce pollution, like carbon pollution, in ways that is cost effective.
Does Mr. Rush wish to ask any wrap-up questions?
No, no, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any additional questions.
Okay. Let me, just for clarification before we adjourn, as I understand the Obama administration approach on greenhouse gases that you've elaborated on, you're not going to set a standard based on fuel. You're not trying to set an emission level based on coal, or an emission level based on natural gas, or an emission level based on an alternative.
No, our greenhouse gas permitting process starts with the proposal on the table. If it starts with a coal facility, those are the technologies.
So if I have in Ohio a coal-fired power plant that is 50 years old, and I want to maintain that plant as is, I'm not going to have to do anything under your regulatory approach.
On the greenhouse gases, if you are not, you don't need a permit unless you're conducting a major modification.
But if I freeze my technology, I say I'm going to use the same fuel source, I'm going to use the same plant equipment in the same location, and I have a 400 megawatt coal-fired power plant, I don't have to do anything under the regulatory approach that y'all are proposing.
You would not need to get a greenhouse gas permit. We would not be looking at your facility in terms of best
You're only going to look at facilities that are under renovation or are under permitting as new source, new stationary sources.
That's correct, and only when you're a very large facility and you're making a large increase in greenhouse gases as a result. Okay. And even then, all you're looking at are building efficiencies into the system.
Seeing no further members present wishing to ask questions, we thank the gentlelady for her time, and this subcommittee is adjourned.